Chicago, Cleveland, Los Angeles, Washington. Over 20 cities in all. Just around that time, Miami blacks rioted against police brutality. They were reacting against their general deprivation as well. The unemployment rate among young African Americans had risen above 50%, and the Reagan administration's only response to poverty was to build more jails. Understanding that blacks would not vote for him, Reagan tried unsuccessfully to get Congress to eliminate a crucial section of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which had been very effective in safeguarding the right of blacks to vote in the southern states. Reagan's policies clearly joined the two issues of disarmament and social welfare. It was guns versus children, and this was expressed dramatically by the head of the Children's Defense Fund, Marion Wright Edelman, in a commencement speech at the Milton Academy in Massachusetts in the summer of 1983. You are graduating into a nation and world teetering on the brink of moral and economic bankruptcy. Since 1980, our President and Congress have been turning our national plowshares into swords and been bringing good news to the rich at the expense of the poor. Children are the major victims. Our misguided national and world choices are literally killing children daily. Yet, governments throughout the world, led by our own, spend over $600 billion a year on arms, while an estimated 1 billion of our world's people live in poverty and 600 million are under or unemployed. Where is the human commitment and political will to find the relative pittance of money needed to protect children? She urged her listeners, pick a piece of the problem that you can help solve while trying to see how your piece fits into the broader social change puzzle. Her words seemed to represent a growing mood that worried the Reagan administration. It withdrew some of its proposed cutbacks, and Congress eliminated others. When, in its second year, the administration proposed $9 billion in cuts in support for children and poor families, Congress accepted only $1 billion. The Washington correspondent of the New York Times reported, political concerns about the fairness of Mr. Reagan's programs have forced the administration to curtail its efforts to make further cutbacks in programs for the poor. The repeated elections of Republican candidates, Reagan in 1980 and 1984, George Bush in 1988, were treated by the press with words like landslide and overwhelming victory. They were ignoring four facts: that roughly half the population, though eligible to vote, did not; that those who did vote were limited severely in their choices to the two parties that monopolized the money and the media; that as a result, many of their votes were cast without enthusiasm; and that there was little relationship between voting for a candidate and voting for specific policies. In 1980, Reagan received 51.6% of the popular vote, while Jimmy Carter received 41.7%, and John Anderson, a liberal Republican running on a third-party ticket, received 6.7%. Only 54% of the voting-age population voted, so that of the total eligible to vote, 27% voted for Reagan. A survey by the New York Times found that only 11% of those who voted for Reagan did so because he's a real conservative. 3 times as many said they voted for him because it's time for a change. For a second term running against former Vice President Walter Mondale, Reagan won 59% of the popular vote. But with half the electorate not voting, he had 29% of the voting population. In the 1988 election, with Vice President George Bush running against Democrat Michael Dukakis, Bush's 54% victory added up to 27% of the eligible voters. Because our peculiar voting arrangements allow a small margin of popular votes to become a huge majority of electoral votes, the media can talk about overwhelming victory, thus deceiving their readers and disheartening those who don't look closely at the statistics. Could one say from these figures that the American people wanted Reagan or Bush as president? One could certainly say that more voters preferred the Republican candidates to their opponents, but even more seemed to want neither candidate. Nevertheless, on the basis of these slim electoral pluralities, Reagan and Bush would claim that the people had spoken. Indeed, when the people did speak about issues, in surveys of public opinion, they expressed beliefs to which neither the Republican nor Democratic parties paid attention. For instance, both parties, through the 80s and early 90s, kept strict limits on social programs for the poor, on the grounds that this would require more taxes, and the people did not want higher taxes. This was certainly true as a general proposition, that Americans wanted to pay as little in taxes as possible. But when they were asked if they would be willing to pay higher taxes for specific purposes like health and education, they said yes, they would. For instance, a 1990 poll of Boston area voters showed that 54% of them would pay more taxes if that would go toward cleaning up the environment. And when higher taxes were presented in class terms rather than as a general proposal, people were quite clear. A Wall Street Journal NBC News poll in December 1990 showed that 84% of the respondents favored a surtax on millionaires. This provision was dropped around that time from a Democratic-Republican budget compromise. Even though 51% of the respondents were in favor of raising the capital gains tax, neither major party favored that. A Harris-Harvard School of Public Health poll of 1989 showed that most Americans, 61%, favored a Canadian-type health system in which the government was the single payer to doctors and hospitals, bypassing the insurance companies and offering universal medical coverage to everyone. Neither the Democratic nor the Republican Party adopted that as its program, although both insisted they wanted to reform the health system. A survey by the Gordon Black Corporation for the National Press Club in 1992 found that 59% of all voters wanted a 50% cut in defense spending in 5 years. Neither of the major parties was willing to make major cuts in the military budget. How the public felt about government aid to the poor seemed to depend on how the question was put. Both parties and the media talked incessantly about the welfare system, that it was not working, and the word welfare became a signal for opposition. When people were asked, a New York Times CBS News poll of 1992, if more money should be allocated to welfare, 23% said no. But when the same people were asked, should the government help the poor, 64% said yes. This was a recurring theme. When at the height of the Reagan presidency in 1987, people were asked if the government should guarantee food and shelter to needy people, 62% answered yes. Clearly, there was something amiss with a political system, supposed to be democratic, in which the desires of the voters were repeatedly ignored. They could be ignored with impunity so long as the political system was dominated by two parties, both tied to corporate wealth. An electorate forced to choose between Carter and Reagan, or Reagan and Mondale, or Bush and Dukakis, could only despair or decide not to vote, because neither candidate was capable of dealing with a fundamental economic illness whose roots were deeper than any single presidency. That illness came from a fact which was almost never talked about, that the United States was a class society in which 1% of the population owned 33% of the wealth, with an underclass of 30 to 40 million people in poverty. The social programs of the 60s, Medicare and Medicaid, food stamps, etc., did not do much more than maintain the historic American maldistribution of resources. While the Democrats would give more help to the poor than the Republicans, they were not capable, indeed not really desirous, of seriously tampering with an economic system in which corporate profit comes before human need. There was no important national movement for radical change, no social democratic or democratic socialist party, such as existed in countries in Western Europe, Canada, and New Zealand. But there were 1,000 signs of alienation, voices of protest, legal actions in every part of the country to call attention to deep-felt grievances, to demand that some injustice be remedied. For instance, The Citizens Clearinghouse for Hazardous Wastes in Washington, D.C., which had been formed early in the Reagan administration by housewife and activist Lois Gibbs, reported that it was giving help to 8,000 local groups around the country. One of these groups in Oregon brought a series of successful lawsuits to force the Environmental Protection Agency to do something about unsafe drinking water in the Bull Run Reservoir near Portland. In Seabrook, New Hampshire, there were years of persistent protest against a nuclear power plant, which residents considered a danger to themselves and their families. Between 1977 and 1989, over 3,500 people were arrested in these protests. Ultimately, the plant, plagued by financial problems and opposition, had to shut down. Fear of nuclear accidents was intensified by disastrous events at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania in 1979, and by an especially frightening calamity in Chernobyl in the Soviet Union in 1986. All of this was having an effect on the once booming nuclear industry. By 1994, the Tennessee Valley Authority had stopped the construction of 3 nuclear plants, which the New York Times called the symbolic death notice for the current generation of reactors in the United States. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, thousands of people demonstrated year after year against the Honeywell Corporation's military contracts. And between 1982 and 1988, over 1,800 people were arrested. Furthermore, when those who engaged in such civil disobedience were brought into court, they often found sympathetic support from juries, winning acquittals from ordinary citizens who seemed to understand that even if they had technically broken the law, they had done so in a good cause. In 1984, a group of Vermont citizens, the Winooski 44, refused to leave the hallway outside a U.S. Senator's office, protesting his votes to give arms to the Nicaraguan Contras. They were arrested, but at their trial, they were treated sympathetically by the judge and acquitted by the jury. At another trial shortly after, a number of people, including activist Abby Hoffman and Amy Carter, daughter of former President Jimmy Carter, were charged with blocking CIA recruiters at the University of Massachusetts. They called to the witness stand ex-CIA agents who told the jury that the CIA had engaged in illegal and murderous activities all around the world. The jury acquitted them. One jury, a woman hospital worker, said later, "I was not familiar with the CIA's activities. I was shocked. I was kind of proud of the students." Another juror said, "It was very educational." The county district attorney prosecuting the case concluded, "If there is a message, it was that this jury was composed of Middle America. Middle America doesn't want the CIA doing what they're doing." In the South, while there was no great movement comparable to the civil rights movement of the 60s, there were hundreds of local groups organizing poor people, white and black. In North Carolina, Linda Stout, the daughter of a mill worker who had died of industrial poisons, coordinated a multiracial network of 500 textile workers, farmers, maids, most of them low-income women of color, in the Piedmont Peace Project. The historic Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, which had nurtured so many black and white activists throughout the South, was now joined by other folk schools and popular education centers. Anne Braden, a veteran of racial and labor struggles in the South, was still organizing, leading the Southern Organizing Committee for Economic and Social Justice. The group gave help in local actions to 300 African Americans in Tift County, Georgia, who were protesting the existence of a chemical plant which was making them sick, to Native Americans in Cherokee County, North Carolina, who were organizing to stop a polluted landfill. Back in the 60s, Chicano farm workers, people of Mexican descent who came to work and lived mostly in California and the southwestern states, rebelled against their feudal working conditions. They went out on strike and organized a national boycott of grapes under the leadership of Cesar Chavez. Soon, farm workers were organizing in other parts of the country. In the 70s and 80s, their struggles against poverty and discrimination continued. The Reagan years hit them hard, as it did poor people all over the country. By 1984, 42% of all Latino children and 1/4 of the families lived below the poverty line. Copper miners in Arizona, mostly Mexican, went on strike against the Phelps Dodge Company after it cut wages, benefits, and safety measures in 1983. They were attacked by National Guardsmen and state troopers, by tear gas and helicopters, but held out for 3 years until a combination of governmental and corporate power finally defeated them. There were victories, too. In 1985, 1,700 cannery workers, most of them Mexican women, went on strike in Watsonville, California, and won a union contract with medical benefits. In 1990, workers who had been laid off from the Levi Strauss Company in San Antonio because the company was moving to Costa Rica called a boycott, organized a hunger strike, and won concessions. In Los Angeles, Latino janitors went on strike in 1990, and despite police attacks, won recognition of their union, a pay raise, and sick benefits. Latino and Latina activists, not necessarily Chicano, which refers to those of Mexican ancestry, through the 80s and early 90s, campaigned for better labor conditions, for representation in local government, for tenants' rights, for bilingual education in the schools. Kept out of the media, they organized a bilingual radio movement, and by 1991 had 14 Latino stations in the country, 12 of them bilingual. In New Mexico, Latinos fought for land and water rights against real estate developers who tried to throw them off land they had lived on for decades. In 1988, there was a confrontation, and the people organized an armed occupation, built bunkers for protection against attack, and won support from other communities in the Southwest. Finally, a court ruled in their favor. Abnormal rates of cancer for farm workers in California aroused the Chicano community. Cesar Chavez of the United Farm Workers fasted for 35 days in 1988 to call attention to those conditions. There were now United Farm Workers unions in Texas, Arizona, and other states. The importation of Mexican workers for low wages under terrible conditions spread from the Southwest to other parts of the country. By 1991, 80,000 Latinos lived in North Carolina, 30,000 in North Georgia. The Farm Labor Organizing Committee, which had won a difficult strike in the Ohio tomato fields in 1979, the largest agricultural strike ever in the Midwest, brought thousands of farm workers together in several Midwest states. As the Latino population of the country kept growing, it soon matched the 12% of the population that was African American and began to have a distinct effect on American culture. Much of its music, art, and drama was much more consciously political and satirical than mainstream culture. The Border Arts Workshop was formed in 1984 by artists and writers in San Diego and Tijuana, and its work dealt powerfully with issues of racism and injustice. In Northern California, Teatro Campesino and Teatro de la Esperanza performed for working people all over the country, turning schoolhouses, churches, and fields into theaters. Latinos were especially conscious of the imperial role the United States had played in Mexico and the Caribbean, and many of them became militant critics of U.S. policy toward Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Cuba. In 1970, a great march in Los Angeles against the Vietnam War, which had been attacked by police, left 3 Chicanos dead. When the Bush administration was preparing for war against Iraq in the summer of 1990, thousands of people in Los Angeles marched along the same route they had taken 20 years before, when they were protesting the Vietnam War. As Elizabeth Martinez wrote, 500 Years of Chicano History and Pictures. Before and during President Bush's war in the Persian Gulf, many people, including Raza, literally race, a term adopted by Latino activists, had doubts about it or were opposed. We had learned some lessons about wars started in the name of democracy that turned out to benefit only the rich and powerful. Raza mobilized to protest this war of mass murder even faster than the U.S. war in Vietnam, though we could not stop it. In 1992, a fundraising group which came out of the Vietnam War called Resist made donations to 168 organizations around the country, community groups, peace groups, Native American groups, prisoners' rights organizations, health and environmental groups. A new generation of lawyers, schooled in the 60s, constituted a small but socially conscious minority within the legal profession. They were in court defending the poor and the helpless, or bringing suit against powerful corporations. One law firm used its talent and energy to defend whistleblowers, men and women who were fired because they blew the whistle on corporate corruption that victimized the public. The women's movement, which had managed to raise the consciousness of the whole nation on the issue of sexual equality, faced a powerful backlash in the 80s. The Supreme Court's defense of abortion rights in its 1973 Roe v. Wade decision aroused a pro-life movement that had strong supporters in Washington. Congress passed, and the Supreme Court later let stand, a law that eliminated federal medical benefits to help poor women pay for abortions. But the National Organization of Women and other groups remained strong. In 1989, a Washington rally for what had come to be known as the right to choose drew over 300,000 people. When in 1994 and 1995, abortion clinics were attacked and several supporters murdered, the conflict became grimly intense. The rights of gay and lesbian Americans had come vividly to the forefront in the 70s with radical changes in ideas about sexuality and freedom. The gay movement then became a visible presence in the nation, with parades, demonstrations, campaigns for the elimination of state statutes discriminating against homosexuals. One result was a growing literature about the hidden history of gay life in the United States and in Europe. In 1994, there was a Stonewall 25 march in Manhattan, which commemorated an event homosexuals regarded as a turning point. 25 years earlier, gay men fought back vigorously against a police raid on the Stonewall Bar in Greenwich Village. In the early 90s, gay and lesbian groups campaigned more openly, more determinedly against discrimination, and for more attention to the scourge of AIDS, which they claimed was being given only marginal attention by the national government. In Rochester, New York, a local campaign achieved an unprecedented decision barring military recruiters from a school district because of the Defense Department discrimination against gay soldiers. The labor movement in the 80s and 90s was considerably weakened by the decline of manufacturing, by the flight of factories to other countries, by the hostility of the Reagan administration and its appointees on the National Labor Relations Board. Yet organizing continued, especially among white-collar workers and low-income people of color. The AFL-CIO put on hundreds of new organizers to work among Latinos, African Americans, and Asian Americans. Rank-and-file workers in old, stagnant unions began to rebel. In 1991, the notoriously corrupt leadership of the powerful Teamsters Union was voted out of office by a reform slate. The new leadership immediately became a force in Washington and took the lead in working for independent political coalitions outside the two major parties. But the labor movement as a whole, much diminished, was struggling for survival. Against the overwhelming power of corporate wealth and governmental authority, the spirit of resistance was kept alive in the early 90s, often by small-scale acts of courage and defiance. On the West Coast, a young activist named Keith McHenry and hundreds of others were arrested again and again for distributing free food to poor people without a license. They were part of a program called Food, Not Bombs. More Food, Not Bombs groups sprang up in communities around the country. In 1992, a New York group interested in revising traditional ideas about American history received approval from the New York City Council to put up 30 metal plaques high on lampposts around the city. One of them, placed opposite the Morgan corporate headquarters, identified the famous banker J.P. Morgan as a Civil War draft dodger. In fact, Morgan had avoided the draft and profited in business deals with the government during the war. Another plaque, placed near the stock exchange, portrayed a suicide and carried the label, "Advantage of an Unregulated Free Market." The general disillusionment with government during the Vietnam years and the Watergate scandals, the exposure of anti-democratic actions by the FBI and the CIA, led to resignations from government and open criticism by former employees. A number of former CIA officials left the agency and wrote books critical of its activities. John Stockwell, who had headed the CIA operation in Angola, resigned, wrote a book exposing the CIA's activities, and lectured all over the country about his experiences. David McMichael, a historian and former CIA specialist, testified at trials on behalf of people who had protested government policy in Central America. FBI agent Jack Ryan, a 21-year veteran of the Bureau, was fired when he refused to investigate peace groups. He was deprived of his pension and for some time had to live in a shelter for homeless people. Sometimes the war in Vietnam, which had ended in 1975, came back to public attention in the 80s and 90s through people who had been involved in the conflicts of that day. Some of them had since made dramatic turnabouts in their thinking. John Wall, who prosecuted Dr. Benjamin Spock and 4 others in Boston for conspiring to obstruct the draft, showed up at a dinner honoring the defendants in 1994, saying the trial had changed his ideas. Even more striking was the statement by Charles Hutto, a U.S. soldier who had participated in the atrocity known as the My Lai Massacre, in which a company of American soldiers shot to death women and children by the hundreds in a tiny Vietnamese village. Interviewed in the 80s, Hutto told a reporter, "I was 19 years old, and I'd always been told to do what the grown-ups told me to do. But now I'll tell my sons, if the government calls, to go, to serve their country, but to use their own judgment at times, to forget about authority, to use their own conscience. I wish somebody had told me that before I went to Vietnam. I didn't know. Now I don't think there should even be a thing called war, because it messes up a person's mind." It was this legacy of the Vietnam War, the feeling among a great majority of Americans that it was a terrible tragedy, a war that should not have been fought, that plagued the Reagan and Bush administrations, which still hoped to extend American power around the world. In 1985, when George Bush was vice president, former Defense Secretary James Schlesinger had warned the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Vietnam brought a sea change in domestic attitudes, a breakdown in the political consensus behind foreign policy. When Bush became president, he was determined to overcome what came to be called the Vietnam Syndrome, the resistance of the American people to a war desired by the establishment. And so he launched the air war against Iraq in mid-January 1991 with overwhelming force, so the war could be over quickly before there was time for a national anti-war movement to develop. The signs of a possible movement were there in the months of the pre-war buildup. On Halloween, 600 students marched through downtown Missoula, Montana, shouting, "Hell no, we won't go." In Shreveport, Louisiana, despite the Shreveport Journal's front-page headline, "Poll favors military action," the story was that 42% of the respondents thought the U.S. should initiate force, and 41% said, "Wait and see." The November 11th, 1990 Veterans Parade in Boston was joined by a group called Veterans for Peace, carrying signs, "No more Vietnams, bring them home now," and "Oil and blood do not mix, wage peace." The Boston Globe reported that the protesters were greeted with respectful applause, and at some places, strong demonstrations of support by onlookers. One of those onlookers, a woman named Mary Bell Dressler, said, "Personally, parades that honor the military are somewhat troublesome to me because the military is about war, and war is troublesome to me." Most Vietnam veterans were supporting military action, but there was a strong dissident minority. In one survey that showed 53% of the veterans polled saying they would gladly serve in the Gulf War, 37% said they would not. Perhaps the most famous Vietnam veteran, Ron Kovic, author of Born on the 4th of July, made a 30-second television speech as Bush moved toward war. In the appeal, broadcast on 200 television stations in 120 cities across the country, he asked all citizens to stand up and speak out against war. How many more Americans coming home in wheelchairs like me will it take before we learn? That November of 1990, several months into the Kuwait crisis, college students in St. Paul, Minnesota, demonstrated against war. The local press reported, "It was a full-blown anti-war demonstration, with mothers pushing kids in strollers, college professors and grade school teachers carrying signs, peace activists bedecked in peace symbols, and hundreds of students from a dozen schools singing, beating drums and chanting, 'Hey, hey, ho, ho, we won't fight for Amoco.'" 10 days before the bombing began, at a town meeting in Boulder, Colorado, with 800 people present, the question was put, "Do you support Bush's policy for war?" Only 4 people raised their hands. A few days before the war began, 4,000 people in Santa Fe, New Mexico, blocked a 4-lane highway for an hour, asking that there be no war. Residents said this was larger than any demonstration in the Vietnam era. On the eve of war, 6,000 people marched through Ann Arbor, Michigan to ask for peace. On the night the war began, 5,000 people gathered in San Francisco to denounce the war and formed a human chain around the Federal Building. Police broke the chain by swinging their clubs at the hands of the protesters. But the San Francisco Board of Supervisors passed a resolution declaring the city and county a sanctuary for those who, for moral, ethical, or religious reasons, cannot participate in war. The night before Bush gave the order to launch the bombing, a 7-year-old girl in Lexington, Massachusetts, told her mother she wanted to write a letter to the president. Her mother suggested it was late and she should write the next day. "No, tonight," the girl said. She was still learning to write, so she dictated a letter. "Dear President Bush, I don't like the way you are behaving. If you would make up your mind there won't be a war, we won't have to have peace vigils. If you were in a war, you wouldn't want to get hurt. What I'm saying is, I don't want any fighting to happen. Sincerely yours, Serena Cabot." After the bombing of Iraq began, along with the bombardment of public opinion, the polls showed overwhelming support for Bush's action, and this continued through the 6 weeks of the war. But was it an accurate reflection of the citizenry's long-term feelings about war? The split vote in the polls just before the war reflected a public still thinking its opinion might have an effect. Once the war was on, and clearly irreversible, in an atmosphere charged with patriotic fervor, the president of the United Church of Christ spoke of the steady drumbeat of war messages. It was not surprising that a great majority of the country would declare its support. Nevertheless, even with little time to organize, and with the war over very fast, there was an opposition. A minority, for sure, but a determined one, and with the potential to grow. Compared to the first months of the military escalation in Vietnam, the movement against the Gulf War expanded with extraordinary speed and vigor. That first week of the war, while it was clear most Americans were supporting Bush's action, tens of thousands of people took to the streets in protest, in towns and cities all over the country. In Athens, Ohio, over 100 people were arrested as they clashed with a pro-war group. In Portland, Maine, 500 marched, wearing white armbands or carrying white paper crosses with one word, "Why," written in red. At the University of Georgia, 70 students opposed to the war held an all-night vigil, and in the Georgia legislature, Representative Cynthia McKinnon made a speech attacking the bombing of Iraq, leading many of the other legislators to walk off the floor. She held her ground, and it seemed that there had been at least some change in thinking since Representative Julian Bond was expelled from the very same legislature for criticizing the war in Vietnam during the 1960s. At a junior high school in Newton, Massachusetts, 350 students marched to City Hall to present a petition to the mayor declaring their opposition to the war in the Gulf. Clearly, many were trying to reconcile their feelings about war with their sympathy for soldiers sent to the Middle East. A student leader, Carly Baker, said, "We don't think bloodshed is the right way. We are supporting the troops and are proud of them, but we don't want war." In Ada, Oklahoma, while East Central Oklahoma State University was adopting 2 National Guard units, 2 young women sat quietly on top of the concrete entrance gate with signs that read, "Teach peace, not war." One of them, Patricia Biggs, said, "I don't think we should be over there. I don't think it's about justice and liberty. I think it's about economics. The big oil corporations have a lot to do with what is going on over there. We are risking people's lives for money. 4 days after the United States launched its air attack, 75,000 people, the estimate of the Capitol Police, marched in Washington, rallying near the White House to denounce the war. In Southern California, Ron Kovic addressed 6,000 people who chanted, "Peace now." In Fayetteville, Arkansas, a group supporting military policy was confronted by the Northwest Arkansas Citizens Against War, who marched carrying a flag-draped coffin and a banner that read, "Bring them home alive." Another disabled Vietnam veteran, a professor of history and political science at York College in Pennsylvania named Philip Avila, wrote in a local newspaper, "Yes, we need to support our men and women under arms, but let's support them by bringing them home, not by condoning this barbarous, violent policy." In Salt Lake City, hundreds of demonstrators, many with children, marched through the city's main streets, chanting anti-war slogans. In Vermont, which had just elected socialist Bernie Sanders to Congress, over 2,000 demonstrators disrupted a speech by the governor at the State House. And in Burlington, Vermont's largest city, 300 protesters walked through the downtown area, asking shop owners to close their doors in solidarity. On January 26, 9 days after the beginning of the war, over 150,000 people marched through the streets of Washington, D.C., and listened to speakers denounce the war, including the movie stars Susan Sarandon and Tim Robbins. A woman from Oakland, California, held up the folded American flag that was given to her when her husband was killed in Vietnam, saying, "I learned the hard way, there is no glory in a folded flag." Labor unions had supported the war in Vietnam for the most part, but after the bombing started in the Gulf, 11 affiliates of the AFL-CIO, including some of its more powerful unions like steel, auto, communications, chemical workers, spoke out against the war. The black community was far less enthusiastic than the rest of the country about what the U.S. Air Force was doing to Iraq. An ABC News Washington Post poll in early February 1991 found that support for the war was 84% among whites, but only 48% among African Americans. When the war had been going on for a month, with Iraq devastated by the incessant bombing, there were feelers from Saddam Hussein that Iraq would withdraw from Kuwait if the United States would stop its attacks. Bush rejected the idea, and a meeting of black leaders in New York sharply criticized him, calling the war an immoral and unspiritual diversion, a blatant evasion of our domestic responsibilities. In Selma, Alabama, which had been the scene of bloody police violence against civil rights marchers 26 years before, a meeting to observe the anniversary of that bloody Sunday demanded that our troops be brought home alive to fight for justice at home. The father of a 21-year-old Marine in the Persian Gulf, Alex Molnar, wrote an angry open letter published in the New York Times to President Bush. "Where were you, Mr. President, when Iraq was killing its own people with poison gas? Why, until the recent crisis, was it business as usual with Saddam Hussein, the man you now call a Hitler? Is the American way of life that you say my son is risking his life for the continued right of Americans to consume 25 to 30% of the world's oil? I intend to support my son and his fellow soldiers by doing everything I can to oppose any offensive American military action in the Persian Gulf." There were courageous individual acts by citizens speaking out in spite of threats. Peg Mullen of Brownsville, Texas, whose son had been killed by friendly fire in Vietnam, organized a busload of mothers to protest in Washington, in spite of a warning that her house would be burned down if she persisted. The actress Margot Kidder, Lois Lane in the Superman films, despite the risk to her career, spoke out eloquently against the war. A basketball player for Seton Hall University in New Jersey refused to wear the American flag on his uniform, and when he became the object of derision for this, he left the team and the university and returned to his native Italy. More tragically, a Vietnam veteran in Los Angeles set fire to himself and died to protest the war. In Amherst, Massachusetts, a young man carrying a cardboard peace sign knelt down on the town common, poured 2 cans of flammable fluid on himself, struck 2 matches, and died in the flames. 2 hours later, students from nearby universities gathered on the common for a candlelight vigil and placed peace signs at the site of death. One of the signs read, "Stop this crazy war." There was no time, as there had been during the Vietnam conflict, for a large anti-war movement to develop in the military. But there were men and women who defied their commanders and refused to participate in the war. When the first contingents of U.S. troops were being sent to Saudi Arabia in August of 1990, Corporal Jeff Patterson, a 22-year-old Marine stationed in Hawaii, sat down on the runway of the airfield and refused to board a plane bound for Saudi Arabia. He asked to be discharged from the Marine Corps. I have come to believe that there are no justified wars. I began to question exactly what I was doing in the Marine Corps about the time I began to read about history. I began to read up on America's support for the murderous regimes of Guatemala, Iran under the Shah, and El Salvador. I object to the military use of force against any people, anywhere, anytime. 14 Marine Corps reservists at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, filed for conscientious objector status despite the prospect of a court-martial for desertion. A lance corporal in the Marines, Eric Larson, issued a statement. "I declare myself a conscientious objector. Here is my sea bag full of personal gear. Here is my gas mask. I no longer need them. I am no longer a Marine. It, to me, is embarrassing to fight for a way of life in which basic human needs like a place to sleep, 1 hot meal a day, and some medical attention cannot even be met in our nation's capital." Corporal Yolanda Hewitt Vaughn, a physician who was a captain in the Army Reserve Medical Corps, a mother of 3 young children, and a member of the Physicians for Social Responsibility, was called to active duty in December 1990, a month before the start of the war. She replied, "I am refusing orders to be an accomplice in what I consider an immoral, inhumane, and unconstitutional act, namely an offensive military mobilization in the Middle East." She was court-martialed, convicted of desertion, and sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. Another soldier, Stephanie Atkinson of Murfreesboro, Illinois, refused to report for active duty, saying she thought the U.S. military was in the Persian Gulf solely for economic reasons. She was first placed under house arrest, then given a discharge under other than honorable conditions. An Army physician named Harlow Ballard, stationed at Fort Devens in Massachusetts, refused to follow an order to go to Saudi Arabia. "I would rather go to jail than support this war," he said. "I don't believe there is any such thing as a just war." Over 1,000 reservists declared themselves conscientious objectors. A 23-year-old Marine Corps reservist named Rob Calabro was one of them. "My father tells me that he's ashamed of me. He screams at me that he's embarrassed by me. But I believe that killing people is morally wrong. I believe I am serving my country more by being true to my conscience than by living a lie." An information network sprang up during the Gulf War to tell what was not being told in the major media. There were alternative newspapers in many cities. There were over 100 community radio stations, able to reach only a fraction of those tuned in to the major networks, but the only sources during the Gulf War of critical analyses of the war. An ingenious radio person in Boulder, Colorado, named David Barsamian, recorded a speech by Noam Chomsky made at Harvard, a devastating critique of the war. He then sent the cassette out to his network of community stations, which were eager for a point of view different from the official one. 2 young men in New Jersey then transcribed the talk, put it in pamphlet form, in a shape easily photocopied, and placed the pamphlets in bookstores all over the country. After victorious wars, there is almost always a sobering effect, as the war fervor wears off, and citizens assess the costs and wonder what was gained. War fever was at its height in February 1991. In that month, when people being polled were reminded of the huge costs of the war, only 17% said the war was not worth it. 4 months later, in June, the figure was 30%. In the months that followed, Bush's support in the nation dropped steeply as economic conditions deteriorated. And in 1992, when the war spirit evaporated, Bush went down to defeat. After the disintegration of the Soviet bloc began in 1989, there had been talk in the United States of a peace dividend, the opportunity to take billions of dollars from the military budget and use it for human needs. The war in the Gulf became a convenient excuse for the government determined to stop such talk. A member of the Bush administration said, "We owe Saddam a favor. He saved us from the peace dividend." New York Times, March 2nd, 1991. But the idea of a peace dividend could not be stifled so long as Americans were in need. Shortly after the war, historian Marilyn Young warned, "The U.S. can destroy Iraq's highways, but not build its own, create the conditions for epidemic in Iraq, but not offer health care to millions of Americans. It can excoriate Iraqi treatment of the Kurdish minority, but not deal with domestic race relations, create homelessness abroad, but not solve it here, keep 500,000 troops drug-free as part of a war, but refuse to fund the treatment of millions of drug addicts at home. We shall lose the war after we have won it." In 1992, the limits of military victory became apparent during the quincentennial celebrations of Columbus's arrival in the Western Hemisphere. 500 years ago, Columbus and his fellow conquerors had wiped out the native population of Hispaniola. This was followed during the next 4 centuries by the methodical destruction of Indian tribes by the United States government as it marched across the continent. But now there was a dramatic reaction. The Indians, the Native Americans, had become a visible force since the 60s and 70s, and in 1992 were joined by other Americans to denounce the quincentennial celebrations. For the first time in all the years that the country had celebrated Columbus Day, there were nationwide protests against honoring a man who had kidnapped, enslaved, mutilated, murdered the natives, who greeted his arrival with gifts and friendship. Preparations for the quincentennial began on both sides of the controversy. Official commissions, nationally and in the states, were set up long before the year of the quincentennial. This spurred action by Native Americans. In the summer of 1990, 350 Indians, representatives from all over the hemisphere, met in Quito, Ecuador, at the first intercontinental gathering of indigenous people in the Americas, to mobilize against the glorification of the Columbus conquest. The following summer, in Davis, California, over 100 Native Americans gathered for a follow-up meeting to the Quito Conference. They declared, October 12, 1992, International Day of Solidarity with Indigenous People, and resolved to inform the King of Spain that the replicas of Columbus's 3 ships, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, will not receive permission from the native nations to land in the Western Hemisphere unless he apologizes for the original incursion 500 years ago. The movement grew. The largest ecumenical body in the United States, the National Council of Churches, called on Christians to refrain from celebrating the Columbus quincentennial, saying, "What represented newness of freedom, hope, and opportunity for some was the occasion for oppression, degradation, and genocide for others." The National Endowment for the Humanities funded a traveling exhibition called First Encounter, which romanticized the Columbus conquest. When the exhibition opened at the Florida Museum of National History, Michelle Diamond, a freshman at the University of Florida, climbed aboard a replica of one of Columbus's ships with a sign reading, "Exhibit teaches racism." She said, "It's a human issue, not just a red Indian issue." She was arrested and charged with trespassing, but demonstrations continued for 16 days against the exhibit. A newspaper called Indigenous Thought began publication in early 1991 to create a link among all the counter-Columbus quincentenary activities. It carried articles by Native Americans about current struggles over land stolen by treaty. In Corpus Christi, Texas, Indians and Chicanos joined to protest the city's celebrations of the quincentennial. A woman named Angelina Mendez spoke for the Chicanos. The Chicano nation, in solidarity with our Indian brothers and sisters to the north, come together with them on this day to denounce the atrocity the U.S. government proposes in reenacting the arrival of the Spanish, more specifically, the arrival of Cristobal Colon to the shores of this land. The Columbus controversy brought an extraordinary burst of educational and cultural activity. A professor at the University of California at San Diego, Deborah Small, put together an exhibit of over 200 paintings on wood panels called 1492. She juxtaposed words from Columbus's diary with blown-up fragments from 16th century engravings to dramatize the horrors that accompanied Columbus's arrival in the hemisphere. A reviewer wrote that it does remind us in the most vivid way of how the coming of Western-style civilization to the New World doesn't provide us with a sunny tale. When President Bush attacked Iraq in 1991, claiming that he was acting to end the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait, a group of Native Americans in Oregon distributed a biting and ironic open letter. Dear President Bush, please send your assistance in freeing our small nation from occupation. This foreign force occupied our lands to steal our rich resources. They used biological warfare and deceit, killing thousands of elders, children, and women in the process. As they overwhelmed our land, they deposed our leaders and people of our own government, and in its place, they installed their own government systems that yet today control our daily lives in many ways. As in your own words, the occupation and overthrow of one small nation is one too many. Sincerely, an American Indian. The publication, Rethinking Schools, which represented socially conscious school teachers all over the country, printed a 100-page book called Rethinking Columbus, featuring articles by Native Americans and others, a critical review of children's books on Columbus, a listing of resources for people wanting more information on Columbus, and more reading material on counter-quincentenary. The publication Rethinking Schools, which represented socially conscious school teachers all over the country, printed a 100-page book called Rethinking Columbus, featuring articles by Native Americans and others, a critical review of children's books on Columbus, a listing of resources for people wanting more information on Columbus, and more reading material on counter-quincentenary activities. In a few months, 200,000 copies of the book were sold. A Portland, Oregon teacher named Bill Bigelow, who helped put together Rethinking Schools, took a year off from his regular job to tour the country in 1992, giving workshops to other teachers so that they could begin to tell those truths about the Columbus experience that were omitted from the traditional books and class curricula. One of Bigelow's own students wrote to the publisher Allen and Bacon with a critique of their history text, The American Spirit. I'll just pick one topic to keep it simple. How about Columbus? No, you didn't lie, but saying, though they had a keen interest in the peoples of the Caribbean, Columbus and his crews were never able to live peacefully among them. Makes it seem as if Columbus did no wrong. The reason for not being able to live peacefully is that he and crew took slaves and killed thousands of Indians for not bringing enough gold. Another student wrote, it seemed to me as if the publishers had just printed up some glory story that was supposed to make us feel more patriotic about our country. They want us to look at our country as great and powerful and forever right. A student named Rebecca wrote, of course the writers of the books probably think it's harmless enough. What does it matter who discovered America really? But the thought that I have been lied to all my life about this, and who knows what else, really makes me angry. A group was formed on the West Coast called Italian Americans Against Christopher Columbus, saying, "When Italian Americans identify with native people, we are bringing ourselves, each of us, closer to possible change in the world." In Los Angeles, a high school student named Blake Lindsay went before the city council to argue against celebrating the quincentennial. She spoke to the council about the genocide of the Arawaks, but she got no official response. However, when she told her story on a talk show, a woman phoned in who said she was from Haiti. The girl is right. We have no Indians left. At our last uprising in Haiti, people destroyed the statue of Columbus. Let's have statues for the Aborigines. There were counter-Columbus activities all over the country, unmentioned in the press or on television. In Minnesota alone, a listing for such activities for 1992 reported dozens of workshops, meetings, films, art shows. At Lincoln Center in New York City on October 12th, there was a performance of Leonard Lerman's New World, an opera about what Columbus did to the Indians. In Baltimore, there was a multimedia show about Columbus. In Boston, and then in a national tour, the Underground Railway Theater performed the Christopher Columbus Follies to packed audiences. The protests, the dozens of new books that were appearing about Indian history, the discussions taking place all over the country were bringing about an extraordinary transformation in the educational world. For generations, exactly the same story had been told all American school children about Columbus, a romantic, admiring story. Now, thousands of teachers around the country were beginning to tell that story differently. This aroused anger among defenders of the old history, who derided what they called a movement for political correctness and multiculturalism. They resented the critical treatment of Western expansion and imperialism, which they considered an attack on Western civilization. Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Education, William Bennett, had called Western civilization our common culture, its highest ideas and aspirations. A much publicized book by a philosopher named Alan Bloom, The Closing of the American Mind, expressed horror at what the social movements of the 60s had done to change the educational atmosphere of American universities. To him, Western civilization was the high point of human progress, and the United States its best representative. America tells one story, the unbroken, ineluctable progress of freedom and equality. From its first settlers and its political foundings on, there has been no dispute that freedom and equality are the essence of justice for us. In the 70s and 80s, disabled people organized and created a movement powerful enough to bring about the passage by Congress of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was an unprecedented piece of legislation, setting standards which would enable persons with disabilities to contest discrimination against them, and ensuring they would have access to places where their disabilities would otherwise bar them. In the civil rights movement, Black people disputed that claim of America's standing for freedom and equality. The women's movement had disputed that claim too. And now, in 1992, Native Americans were pointing to the crimes of Western civilization against their ancestors. They were recalling the communitarian spirit of the Indians Columbus met and conquered, trying to tell the history of those millions of people who were here before Columbus, giving the lie to what a Harvard historian, Perry Miller, had called the movement of European culture into the vacant wilderness of America. As the United States entered the 90s, the political system, whether Democrats or Republicans were in power, remained in the control of those who had great wealth. The main instruments of information were also dominated by corporate wealth. The country was divided, though no mainstream political leader would speak of it, into classes of extreme wealth and extreme poverty, separated by an insecure and jeopardized middle class. Yet there was unquestionably, though largely unreported, what a worried mainstream journalist had called a permanent adversarial culture which refused to surrender the possibility of a more equal, more humane society. If there was hope for the future of America, it lay in the promise of that refusal. Chapter 23, The Clinton Presidency. The 8-year presidential term of Bill Clinton, a personable, articulate graduate of Yale Law School, a Rhodes Scholar, and former governor of Arkansas, began with a hope that a bright young person would bring to the country what he promised, change. But Clinton's presidency ended with no chance that it would, as he had wished, make his mark in history as one of the nation's great presidents. His last year in office was marked by sensational scandals surrounding his personal life. More important, he left no legacy of bold innovation in domestic policy or departure from traditional nationalist foreign policy. At home, he surrendered again and again to caution and conservatism, signing legislation that was more pleasing to the Republican Party and big business than to those Democrats who still recalled the bold programs of Franklin Roosevelt. Abroad, there were futile shows of military braggadocio and a subservience to what President Dwight Eisenhower had once warned against, the military-industrial complex. Clinton had barely won election both times. In 1992, with 45% of the voting population staying away from the polls, he only received 43% of the votes, the senior Bush getting 38%. While 19% of the voters showed their distaste for both parties by voting for a third-party candidate, Ross Perot. In 1996, with half the population not voting, Clinton won 49% of the votes against a lackluster Republican candidate, Robert Dole. There was a distinct absence of voter enthusiasm. One bumper sticker read, "If God had intended us to vote, he would have given us candidates." At his second inauguration ceremony, Clinton spoke of the nation at the edge of a new century in a new millennium. He said, "We need a new government for a new century." But Clinton's rhetoric was not matched by his performance. It happened that the inauguration coincided with the nationwide celebration of the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr., and Clinton invoked King's name several times in his address. The two men, however, represented very different social philosophies. By the time King was assassinated in 1968, he had come to believe that our economic system was fundamentally unjust and needed radical transformation. He spoke of the evils of capitalism and asked for a radical redistribution of economic and political power. On the other hand, as major corporations gave money to the Democratic Party on an unprecedented scale, Clinton demonstrated clearly his total confidence in the market system and private enterprise. During his 1992 campaign, the chief executive officer of Martin Marietta Corporation, which held huge and lucrative government contracts for military production, noted, "I think the Democrats are moving more toward business, and business is moving more toward the Democrats." Martin Luther King's reaction to the buildup of military power had been the same as his reaction to the Vietnam War. "This madness must cease," and "The evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together." Clinton was willing to recall King's dream of racial equality, but not his dream of a society rejecting violence. Even though the Soviet Union was no longer a military threat, he insisted that the United States must keep its armed forces dispersed around the globe, prepare for 2 regional wars, and maintain the military budget at Cold War levels. Despite his lofty rhetoric, Clinton showed in his 8 years in office that he, like other politicians, was more interested in electoral victory than in social change. To get more votes, he decided he must move the party closer to the center. This meant doing just enough for blacks, women, and working people to keep their support, while trying to win over white conservative voters with a program of toughness on crime, stern measures on welfare, and a strong military. Clinton in office followed this plan quite scrupulously. He made a few cabinet appointments that suggested support for labor and for social welfare programs, and appointed a black pro-labor man as head of the National Labor Relations Board. But his key appointments to the Treasury and Commerce departments were wealthy corporate lawyers, and his foreign policy staff, the Secretary of Defense, the Director of the CIA, the National Security Advisor, were traditional players on the bipartisan Cold War team. Clinton appointed more people of color to government posts than his Republican predecessors. But if any prospective or actual appointees became too bold, Clinton abandoned them quickly. His Secretary of Commerce, Ronald Brown, who was killed in a plane crash, was black and a corporate lawyer, and Clinton was clearly pleased with him. On the other hand, Lanny Guinier, a black legal scholar who was being considered for a job with the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, was abandoned when conservatives objected to her strong ideas on matters of racial equality and voter representation. And when Surgeon General Jocelyn Elders, a black, made the controversial suggestion that masturbation was a proper subject in sex education, Clinton asked her to resign. This was especially ironic considering Clinton's later sexual adventures in the White House. He showed the same timidity in the two appointments he made to the Supreme Court, making sure that Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer would be moderate enough to be acceptable to Republicans as well as to Democrats. He was not willing to fight for a strong liberal to follow in the footsteps of Thurgood Marshall or William Brennan, who had recently left the court. Breyer and Ginsburg both defended the constitutionality of capital punishment and upheld drastic restrictions on the use of habeas corpus. Both voted with the most conservative judges on the court to uphold the constitutional right of Boston St. Patrick's Day Parade organizers to exclude gay marchers. In choosing judges for the lower federal courts, Clinton showed himself no more likely to appoint liberals than the Republican Gerald Ford had in the 70s. According to a 3-year study published in the Fordham Law Review in early 1996, Clinton's appointments made liberal decisions in less than half their cases. The New York Times noted that while Reagan and Bush had been willing to fight for judges who would reflect their philosophies, Mr. Clinton, in contrast, has been quick to drop judicial candidates if there is even a hint of controversy. Clinton was eager to show he was tough on matters of law and order. Running for president in 1992, while still governor of Arkansas, he flew back to Arkansas to oversee the execution of a mentally retarded man on death row. And early in his administration, in April 1993, he and Attorney General Janet Reno approved an FBI attack on a group of religious zealots who were armed and ensconced in a building complex in Waco, Texas. Instead of waiting for negotiations to bring about a solution, the FBI attacked with rifle fire, tanks, and gas, resulting in a fire that swept through the compound, killing at least 86 men, women, and children. One of the few survivors of the Waco tragedy was David Thibodeau, who in his book, A Place Called Waco, gives us a rare inside description of the human consequences of the government attack. Despite the fact that more than 30 women and children were crowded into the narrow concrete chamber at the base of the residential tower, the tank crashed into the ceiling, shoving chunks of broken concrete onto the people huddled below. 6 women and kids were immediately crushed by falling blocks. The rest were suffocated by the dust and gas vapors as the tank injected massive doses of CS directly into their windowless, unventilated shelter. The charred corpse of 6-year-old Star, David's oldest daughter, David Koresh was the leader of the religious sect, was found with her spine bent into a backward bow until her head almost touched her feet. Her muscles were contracted by the combined effect of the fire's heat and the cyanide in her body, a byproduct of CS gas suffocation. Clinton and Reno gave feeble excuses for what clearly was a reckless decision to launch a military attack on a group of men, women, and children. Reno at one time talked of children being molested, which was totally unsubstantiated, and even if true, could hardly justify the massacre that took place. As so often happens in cases where the government commits murder, the surviving victims were put on trial, with the judge overruling the request of the jury not to levy harsh sentences and ruling for imprisonment up to 40 years. Professor James Fife of Temple University, who taught criminal justice, said, "There is no FBI to investigate the FBI. There is no Justice Department to investigate the Justice Department." One of the people sentenced by the judge was Rinos Avram, who commented, "This nation is supposed to run under laws, not personal feelings. When you ignore the law, you sow the seeds of terrorism." This turned out to be a prophetic statement. Timothy McVeigh, who some years after the Waco tragedy was convicted of bombing the federal building in Oklahoma City, which cost 168 lives, had visited the Waco site twice. Later, according to an FBI affidavit, McVeigh was extremely agitated about the government's assault on Waco. Clinton's law and order approach led him early in his first term to sign legislation cutting funds for state resource centers that supplied lawyers to indigent prisoners. The result, according to Bob Herbert, writing in the New York Times, was that a man facing the death penalty in Georgia had to appear at a habeas corpus proceeding without a lawyer. In 1996, the president signed legislation that made it more difficult for judges to put prison systems under special masters to ensure the improvement of terrible prison conditions. He also approved a new statute withholding federal funds for legal services where lawyers use those funds to handle class action suits. Such suits were important for challenging assaults on civil liberties. The Crime Bill of 1996, which both Republicans and Democrats in Congress voted for overwhelmingly, and which Clinton endorsed with enthusiasm, dealt with the problem of crime by emphasizing punishment, not prevention. It extended the death penalty to a whole range of criminal offenses and provided $8 billion for the building of new prisons. All this was to persuade voters that politicians were tough on crime. But as criminologist Todd Clear wrote in the New York Times, "Tougher is dumber," about the new crime bill, harsher sentencing had added 1 million people to the prison population, giving the United States the highest rate of incarceration in the world, and yet violent crime continued to increase. Why, Clear asked, do harsh penalties seem to have so little to do with crime? A crucial reason is that police and prisons have virtually no effect on the sources of criminal behavior. He pointed to those sources. About 70% of prisoners in New York State come from 8 neighborhoods in New York City. These neighborhoods suffer profound poverty, exclusion, marginalization, and despair. All these things nourish crime. Those holding political power, whether Clinton or his Republican predecessors, had something in common. They sought to keep their power by diverting the anger of citizens to groups without the resources to defend themselves. As H.L. Mencken, the acerbic social critic of the 1920s, put it, "The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary." Criminals were among these hobgoblins. Also, immigrants, people on welfare, and certain governments, Iraq, North Korea, Cuba. By turning attention to them, by inventing or exaggerating their dangers, the failures of the American system could be concealed. Immigrants were a convenient object of attack because, as non-voters, their interests could be safely ignored. It was easy for politicians to play upon the xenophobia that has erupted from time to time in American history, the anti-Irish prejudices of the mid-19th century, the continual violence against Chinese who had been brought in to work on the railroads, the hostility toward immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe that led to the restrictive immigration laws of the 1920s. The reform spirit of the 60s had led to an easing of restrictions on immigration, but in the 90s, Democrats and Republicans alike played on the economic fears of working Americans. Jobs were being lost because corporations were firing employees to save money, downsizing, or moving plants out of the country to more profitable situations. Immigrants, especially the large numbers coming over the southern border from Mexico, were blamed for taking jobs from citizens of the United States, for receiving government benefits, for causing higher taxes on American citizens. Both major political parties joined to pass legislation, which Clinton then signed, to remove welfare benefits, food stamps, payments to elderly and disabled people, from not only illegal but legal immigrants. By early 1997, letters were going out to close to 1 million legal immigrants who were poor, old, or disabled, warning them that their food stamps and cash payments would be cut off in a few months unless they became citizens. For perhaps 500,000 legal immigrants, passing the tests required for becoming a citizen was quite impossible. They could not read English, were sick or disabled, or were just too old to learn. An immigrant from Portugal living in Massachusetts told a reporter through an interpreter, "Every day we are afraid the letter will come. What will we do if we lose our checks? We will starve. Oh my God, it will not be worth living." Illegal immigrants fleeing poverty in Mexico began to face harsher treatment in the early 90s. Thousands of border guards were added. A Reuters dispatch from Mexico City, April 3, 1997, said about the tougher policy, "Any crackdown against illegal immigration automatically angers Mexicans, millions of whom migrate legally and illegally across the 2,000-mile border to the United States in search of jobs each year. Hundreds of thousands of Central Americans who had fled death squads in Guatemala and El Salvador, while the United States was giving military aid to those governments, now faced deportation because they had never been deemed political refugees. To admit that these cases were political would have given the lie to U.S. claims at the time that those repressive regimes were improving their human rights record and therefore deserved to continue receiving military aid. In early 1996, Congress and the President joined to pass an Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, allowing deportation of any immigrant ever convicted of a crime, no matter how long ago or how serious. Lawful permanent residents who had married Americans and now had children were not exempt. The New York Times reported that July that hundreds of long-term legal residents have been arrested since the law passed. There was a certain irrationality to this new law, for it was passed in response to the blowing up of the federal building in Oklahoma City by Timothy McVeigh, who was native-born. The new government policy toward immigrants, far from fulfilling Clinton's promise of a new government for a new century, was a throwback to the notorious Alien and Sedition laws of 1798 and the McCarthy-era McCarran-Walter Act of the 1950s. It was hardly in keeping with the grand claim inscribed on the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. In the summer of 1996, apparently seeking the support of centrist voters for the coming election, Clinton signed a law to end the federal government's guarantee, created under the New Deal, of financial help to poor families with dependent children. This was called welfare reform, and the law itself had the deceptive title of Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996. By this decision, Clinton alienated many of his former liberal supporters. Peter Edelman resigned from his post in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, bitterly criticizing what he considered Clinton's surrender to the right and the Republicans. Later, Edelman wrote, "His goal was re-election at all costs. His political approach was not to calculate the risks, but to take no risks at all. His penchant for elevating shadow over substance has hurt poor children." The aim of welfare reform was to force poor families receiving federal cash benefits, many of them single mothers with children, to go to work by cutting off their benefits after 2 years, limiting lifetime benefits to 5 years, and allowing people without children to get food stamps for only 3 months in any 3-year period. The Los Angeles Times reported, as legal immigrants lose access to Medicaid and families battle a new 5-year limit on cash benefits, health experts anticipate resurgence of tuberculosis and sexually transmitted diseases. The aim of the welfare cuts was to save $50 billion over a 5-year period, less than the cost of a planned new generation of fighter planes. Even the New York Times, a supporter of Clinton during the election, said that the provisions of the new law had nothing to do with creating work, but everything to do with balancing the budget by cutting programs for the poor. There was a simple but overwhelming problem with cutting off benefits to the poor to force them to find jobs. There were not jobs available for all those who would lose their benefits. In New York City in 1990, when 2,000 jobs were advertised in the sanitation department at $23,000 a year, 100,000 people applied. 2 years later in Chicago, 7,000 people showed up for 550 jobs at Stouffer's, a restaurant chain. In Joliet, Illinois, 200 showed up at Commonwealth Edison at 4:30 a.m. to apply for jobs that did not yet exist. In early 1997, 4,000 people lined up for 700 jobs at the Roosevelt Hotel in Manhattan. It was estimated that at the existing rate of job growth in New York, with 470,000 adults on welfare, it would take 24 years to absorb those thrown off the rolls. What the Clinton administration steadfastly refused to do was to establish government programs to create jobs, as had been done in the New Deal era, when billions were spent to give employment to several million people, from construction workers and engineers to artists and writers. The era of big government is over, Clinton proclaimed as he ran for president in 1996, seeking votes on the supposition that Americans supported the Republican position that government was spending too much. Both parties were misreading public opinion, and the press was often complicit in this. When, in the mid-year election of 1994, only 37% of the electorate went to the polls, and slightly more than half voted Republican, the media reported this as a revolution. A headline in the New York Times read, "Public shows trust in GOP Congress," suggesting that the American people were supporting the Republican agenda of less government. But in the story below that headline, a New York Times CBS News public opinion survey found that 65% of those polled said that it is the responsibility of government to take care of people who can't take care of themselves. Clinton and the Republicans, in joining against big government, were aiming only at social services. The other manifestations of big government, huge contracts to military contractors and generous subsidies to corporations, continued at exorbitant levels. Big government had, in fact, begun with the Founding Fathers, who deliberately set up a strong central government to protect the interests of the bondholders, the slave owners, the land speculators, the manufacturers. For the next 200 years, the American government continued to serve the interests of the wealthy and powerful, offering millions of acres of free land to the railroads, setting high tariffs to protect manufacturers, giving tax breaks to oil corporations, and using its armed forces to suppress strikes and rebellions. It was only in the 20th century, especially in the 30s and 60s, when the government, besieged by protests and fearful of the stability of the system, passed social legislation for the poor, that political leaders and business executives complained about big government. President Clinton reappointed Alan Greenspan as head of the Federal Reserve System, which regulated interest rates. Greenspan's chief concern was to avoid inflation, which bondholders did not want because it would reduce their profits. His financial constituency saw higher wages for workers as producing inflation, and worried that if there was not enough unemployment, wages might rise. Reduction of the annual deficit in order to achieve a balanced budget became an obsession of the Clinton administration. But since Clinton did not want to raise taxes on the wealthy or to cut funds for the military, the only alternative was to sacrifice the poor, the children, the aged, to spend less for health care, for food stamps, for education, for single mothers. Two examples of this appeared early in Clinton's second administration, in the spring of 1997. From the New York Times, May 8, 1997. A major element of President Clinton's education plan, a proposal to spend $5 billion to repair the nation's crumbling schools, was among the items quietly killed in last week's agreement to balance the federal budget. From the Boston Globe, May 22, 1997. After White House intervention, the Senate yesterday rejected a proposal to extend health insurance to the nation's 10.5 million uninsured children. 7 lawmakers switched their votes after senior White House officials called and said the amendment would imperil the delicate budget agreement. The concern about balancing the budget did not extend to military spending. Immediately after he was elected for the first time, Clinton had said, "I want to reaffirm the essential continuity in American foreign policy." In Clinton's presidency, the government continued to spend at least $250 billion a year to maintain the military machine. He was accepting the Republican claim that the nation must be ready to fight 2 regional wars simultaneously, despite the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. At that time, Bush's Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, had said, "The threats have become so remote that they are difficult to discern." General Colin Powell spoke similarly, reported in Defense News, April 8, 1991. "I'm running out of demons. I'm running out of villains. I'm down to Castro and Kim Il-sung." Clinton had been accused during the election campaign of having evaded military service during the Vietnam War, apparently in opposition to the war, like so many other young Americans. Once in the White House, he seemed determined to erase the image of a draft dodger, and took every opportunity to portray himself as a supporter of the military establishment. In the fall of 1993, Clinton's Secretary of Defense, Les Aspin, announced the results of a bottom-up review of the military budget, envisioning the spending of over $1 trillion for the next 5 years. It called for virtually no reduction in major weapons systems. A conservative analyst with the Woodrow Wilson International Center, Anthony Cordesman, commented, "There are no radical departures from the Bush base force or even from earlier U.S. strategy." After being in office 2 years and facing a Republican upsurge in the congressional elections of 1994, Clinton proposed even more money for the military than had been envisioned in the bottom-up review. A New York Times dispatch from Washington, December 1st, 1994, reported, "Trying to quiet Republican criticism that the military is underfinanced, President Clinton held a Rose Garden ceremony today to announce that he would seek a $25 billion increase in military spending over the next 6 years." The examples most often given by the Pentagon of two simultaneous major regional wars were Iraq and North Korea. Yet the 1991 war against Iraq had followed repeated U.S. arming of Iraq in the 80s, and it was reasonable to suppose that heavy military aid to South Korea and a permanent U.S. military force in that country had provoked increases in the North Korean arms budget, which was still much smaller than that of South Korea. Despite these facts, the United States under Clinton was continuing to supply arms to nations all over the world. Clinton, coming into office, approved the sale of F-15 combat planes to Saudi Arabia and F-16s to Taiwan. The Baltimore Sun reported, May 30th, 1994, "Next year, for the first time, the United States will produce more combat planes for foreign air forces than for the Pentagon, highlighting America's replacement of the Soviet Union as the world's main arms supplier." Encouraged by the Clinton administration, the defense industry last year had its best export year ever, having sold $32 billion worth of weapons overseas, more than twice the 1992 total of $15 billion. That pattern continued through the Clinton presidency. In the summer of 2000, the New York Times reported that in the previous year, the United States had sold over $11 billion of arms, 1/3 of all weapons sold worldwide. 2/3 of all arms were sold to poor countries. In 1999, the Clinton administration lifted a ban on advanced weapons to Latin America. The Times called it a victory for the big military contractors like the Lockheed Martin Corporation and the McDonnell Douglas Corporation. Clinton seemed anxious to show strength. He had been in office barely 6 months when he sent the Air Force to drop bombs on Baghdad, presumably in retaliation for an assassination plot against George Bush on the occasion of his visit to Kuwait. The evidence for such a plot was very weak, coming as it did from the notoriously corrupt Kuwaiti police. And Clinton did not wait for the results of the trial supposed to take place in Kuwait of those accused of the plot. And so, U.S. planes, claiming to have targeted intelligence headquarters in the Iraqi capital, bombed a suburban neighborhood, killing at least 6 people, including a prominent Iraqi artist and her husband. The Boston Globe reported, "Since the raid, President Clinton and other officials have boasted of crippling Iraq's intelligence capacity and of sending a powerful message that Iraq leader Saddam Hussein had better behave." It turned out later that there was no significant damage, if any, to Iraqi intelligence facilities, and the New York Times commented, "Mr. Clinton's sweeping statement was reminiscent of the assertions by President Bush and General Norman Schwarzkopf during the Persian Gulf War that later proved to be untrue." Democrats rallied behind the bombing, and the Boston Globe, referring to the use of Article 51 of the United Nations Charter as legal justification for the bombing, said this was diplomatically the proper rationale to invoke. Clinton's reference to the UN Charter conveyed the American desire to respect international law. In fact, Article 51 of the UN Charter permits unilateral military action only in defense against an armed attack, and only when there is no opportunity to convene the Security Council. None of these factors were present in the Baghdad bombing. Columnist Molly Ivins suggested that the bombing of Baghdad for the purpose of sending a powerful message fit the definition of terrorism. The maddening thing about terrorists is that they are indiscriminate in their acts of vengeance, or cries for attention, or whatever. What is true for individuals must also be true of nations. The bombing of Baghdad was a sign that Clinton, facing several foreign policy crises during his 2 terms in office, would react to them in traditional ways, usually involving military action, claiming humanitarian motives, and often with disastrous results for people abroad as well as for the United States. In Somalia, East Africa, in June 1993, with the country in a civil war and people desperate for food, the United States intervened late and badly. As journalist Scott Peterson wrote in Me Against My Brother, at War in Somalia, Sudan, and Rwanda, American and other foreign forces in Somalia committed startling acts of savagery, hiding behind the banner of the United Nations. The Clinton administration made the mistake of intervening in an internal conflict between warlords. It decided to hunt down the most prominent of these, General Mohammed Aidid, in a military operation that ended with the killing of 19 Americans and perhaps 2,000 Somalis in October 1993. The attention of the American public was concentrated, as usual, on the deaths of Americans, glamorized in the film Black Hawk Down. The lives of Somalis seemed much less important. As Peterson wrote, American and UN officers made clear that numbers of Somali dead did not interest them, and they kept no count. In fact, the killing of the American Rangers by an angry Somali mob was preceded months before by a critical decision made by the United States to launch a military attack on a house in which tribal elders were meeting. It was a brutal operation. First, Cobra attack helicopters launched anti-tank missiles. Minutes later, Peterson reports, American ground troops stormed in and began finishing off the survivors, a charge U.S. commanders deny. But a survivor of the raid told Peterson, if they saw people shouting, they killed them. U.S. General Thomas Montgomery called the attack legitimate because they were all bad guys. Admiral Jonathan Howe, representing the UN operation, the United States had insisted an American must be in charge, defended the attack by saying the house was a very key terrorist planning cell and denied that civilians had died, though it was clear that the dead were tribal elders. The claim was that tactical radios were found in the compound later, but Peterson wrote, I have never heard or seen any evidence that this attack even remotely met a single criteria of direct military advantage. Peterson commented, though we all had eyes and had witnessed the crime, mission commanders defended the indefensible and stubbornly clung to the illusion that more war could somehow bring peace. They thought that Somalis would forget the carnage, forget the spilled blood of their fathers and brothers. The Somalis did not forget, and the killing of the American Rangers in October was one consequence. The catastrophic policy in Somalia led to another one the following year in Rwanda, where famine and murderous tribal warfare were ignored. There was a UN force in Rwanda that might have saved tens of thousands of lives, but the United States insisted that it be cut back to a skeleton force. The result was genocide. At least 1 million Rwandans died. As Richard Heeps, a consultant to the Ford Foundation on Africa, wrote to the New York Times, the Clinton administration took the lead in opposing international action. When shortly after, the Clinton administration did intervene with military force in Bosnia, journalist Scott Peterson, who had by this time moved to the Balkans, commented on the difference in reactions to genocide in Africa and in Europe. He said that it was as if a decision had been made somewhere that Africa and Africans were not worth justice. Clinton's foreign policy had very much the traditional bipartisan emphasis on maintaining friendly relations with whatever governments were in power and promoting profitable trade arrangements with them, whatever their record in protecting human rights. Thus, aid to Indonesia continued despite that country's record of mass murder, perhaps 200,000 killed out of a population of 700,000 in the invasion and occupation of East Timor. Democrats and Republicans joined forces as the Senate defeated a proposal to prohibit the sale of lethal weapons to the Suharto regime of Indonesia. The Boston Globe wrote, July 11, 1994, the arguments presented by senators solicitous of Suharto's regime and of defense contractors, oil companies, and mining concerns doing business with Jakarta made Americans seem a people willing to overlook genocide for the sake of commerce. Secretary of State Warren Christopher made the all-too-familiar claim that Indonesia's respect for human rights is improving. This was the Clinton administration's rationale for pursuing business as usual with Suharto and his generals. In 1996, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Jose Ramos Horta of East Timor. Speaking at a church in Brooklyn shortly before he won the prize, Ramos Horta said, "In the summer of 1977, I was here in New York when I received a message telling me that one of my sisters, Maria, 21 years old, had been killed in an aircraft bombing. The aircraft, named Bronco, was supplied by the United States. Within months, a report about a brother, Guy, 17 years old, killed along with many other people in his village by Bell helicopters supplied by the United States. Same year, another brother, Nunu, captured and executed with an American-made M16. Similarly, American-made Sikorsky helicopters were used by Turkey to destroy the villages of rebellious Kurds in what writer John Tierman, Spoils of War, The Human Cost of the Arms Trade, called a campaign of terror against the Kurdish people. By early 1997, the United States was selling more arms abroad than all other nations combined. Lawrence Korb, a Department of Defense official under Reagan, but later a critic of arms sales, wrote, "It has become a money game, an absurd spiral in which we export arms only to have to develop more sophisticated ones to counter those spread out all over the world." Finally, in the last year of the Clinton administration, when mass resistance in East Timor brought about a referendum for independence, military aid stopped and the Suharto regime collapsed. At last, East Timor appeared to be winning its freedom. But military power continued to dominate policy, and the United States often stood alone in refusing to cut back on its weaponry. Though 100 nations signed an agreement to abolish landmines, which were killing tens of thousands of people each year, the United States refused to go along. Though the Red Cross urged governments to suspend the use of cluster bombs, which spewed out thousands of tiny pellets, killing indiscriminately, the United States, which had used them in Vietnam and in the Gulf War, refused to desist. At a UN conference in Rome in 1999, the United States opposed the establishment of a permanent international war crimes court. There was fear that American officials and military leaders, who, like Henry Kissinger, had been responsible for policies leading to the deaths of large numbers of people, might be brought before such a court. Human rights clearly came second to business profit in U.S. foreign policy. When the international group Human Rights Watch issued its 1996 annual report, the New York Times, December 5, 1996, summarized its findings. The organization strongly criticized many powerful nations, particularly the United States, accusing them of failing to press governments in China, Indonesia, Mexico, Nigeria, and Saudi Arabia to improve human rights for fear of losing access to lucrative markets. This criticism was borne out by the Clinton administration's bizarre approach to two nations, China and Cuba, both of which considered themselves communist. China had massacred protesting students in Beijing in 1991 and put dissenters in prison. Yet, the United States continued to give China economic aid and certain trade privileges, most favored nation status, for the sake of U.S. business interests. Cuba had imprisoned critics of the regime, but had no bloody record of suppression as did Communist China or other governments in the world that received U.S. aid. But the Clinton administration continued and even extended a blockade of Cuba that was depriving its population of food and medicine. In its relations with Russia, a concern for stability over morality seemed to motivate the Clinton administration. It insisted on firm support for the regime of Boris Yeltsin, even after Russia initiated a brutal invasion and bombardment of the outlying region of Chechnya, which wanted independence. Both Clinton and Yeltsin, on the occasion of the death of Richard Nixon, expressed admiration for the man who had continued the war in Vietnam, who had violated his oath of office, and who had escaped criminal charges only because he was pardoned by his own vice president. Yeltsin called Nixon one of the greatest politicians in the world, and Clinton said that Nixon, throughout his career, remained a fierce advocate for freedom and democracy around the world. Clinton's foreign economic policy was in keeping with the nation's history, in which both major parties were more concerned for corporate interests than for the rights of working people, here or abroad, and saw foreign aid as a political and economic tool more than as a humanitarian act. In November 1993, an Associated Press dispatch reported the phasing out of economic aid to 35 countries. The administrator for the Agency for International Development, J. Brian Atwood, explained, "We no longer need an AID program to purchase influence." A humanitarian organization, Bread for the World, said that most of the cuts would harm very poor countries, and added with some bitterness that hunger, poverty, and environmental degradation were not priorities for the Clinton administration. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, both dominated by the United States, adopted a hard-nosed banker's approach to debt-ridden third world countries. They insisted that these poor nations allocate a good part of their meager resources to repaying their loans to the rich countries at the cost of cutting social services to their already desperate populations. The emphasis in foreign economic policy was on the market economy and privatization. This forced the people of former Soviet bloc countries to fend for themselves in a supposedly free economy without the social benefits that they had received under the admittedly inefficient and oppressive former regimes. Unregulated market capitalism turned out to be disastrous for people in the Soviet Union, who saw huge fortunes accumulated by a few and deprivation for the masses. The slogan of free trade became an important objective for the Clinton administration, and with the support of Republicans as well as Democrats, Congress enacted the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, with Mexico. This removed obstacles for corporate capital and goods to move freely back and forth across the Mexican-United States border. There was vigorous disagreement over the effects of NAFTA. Some economists claimed it would benefit the United States economy by opening up a larger Mexican market for United States goods. Opponents, including the major trade unions, said there would be a loss of jobs for American workers as corporations moved their operations across the border to hire Mexicans at low pay. Two economists for the Institute for Policy Studies, examining NAFTA in early 1995, after a year of its operation, found that it had caused a net loss of 10,000 U.S. jobs. While more workers in Mexico were now hired by U.S. corporations that moved there, they were working at low wages, with lax enforcement of workers' rights and environmental standards. The claim of the United States to support free trade was hardly to be believed, since the government interfered with trade when this did not serve the national interest, which was a euphemism for corporate interest. Thus, it went to lengths to prevent tomato growers in Mexico from entering the U.S. market. In an even more flagrant violation of the principle of free trade, the United States would not allow shipments of food or medicine to Iraq or to Cuba. In 1996, on the television program 60 Minutes, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Madeleine Albright was asked about the report that 500,000 children have died as a result of sanctions against Iraq. That is more children than died in Hiroshima. Is the price worth it? Albright replied, "I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it." The U.S. government did not seem to recognize that its punitive foreign policies, its military installations in countries all over the globe, might arouse anger in foreign countries, and that anger might turn to violence. When it did, the only response that the United States could think of was to react with more violence. Thus, when U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were bombed in 1998, the Clinton administration responded by bombing targets in Afghanistan and the Sudan. The claim was that the Afghanistan target was a base for terrorist activity, though there was no proof of this. As for the Sudan, the United States insisted it had bombed a plant manufacturing chemical weapons, but it turned out to be a factory that produced medicines for half the population of the country. The human consequences of that loss of medicine could not be calculated. In that same year, Clinton faced the greatest crisis of his presidency. The nation learned that a young government worker, Monica Lewinsky, had been making secret visits to the White House for sexual liaisons with the president. This became a sensational story, occupying the front pages of newspapers for months. An independent counsel was appointed to investigate, who took lurid, detailed testimony from Monica Lewinsky, who had been exposed by a friend who had taped their conversations, about sexual contact with Clinton. Clinton lied about his relationship with Lewinsky, and the House of Representatives voted to impeach him on the ground that he had lied in denying sexual relations with the young woman, and that he had obstructed justice by trying to conceal information about their relationship. This was only the second time in American history that a president had been impeached, and here too, as in the case of Andrew Johnson after the Civil War, the impeachment did not lead to the end of Clinton's presidency because the Senate did not vote for removal. What the incident showed was that a matter of personal behavior could crowd out of the public's attention far more serious matters, indeed, matters of life and death. The House of Representatives would impeach the president on matters of sexual behavior, but it would not impeach him for endangering the lives of children by welfare reform, or for violating international law in bombing other countries, Iran, Afghanistan, Sudan, or for allowing hundreds of thousands of children to die as a result of economic sanctions, Iraq. In 1999, Clinton's last year in office, a crisis erupted in the Balkans that once again showed the U.S. government as disposed to use force rather than diplomacy in solving matters of international concern. The problem that arose came out of the breakup 10 years earlier of the Republic of Yugoslavia and the ensuing conflicts among the separated elements of a once united country. One of the parts of the former Yugoslavia was Bosnia-Herzegovina, with Croats massacring Serbs and Serbs massacring Croats and Muslims. After a vicious Serb attack on the city of Srebrenica, the United States bombed Serb positions, and then negotiations in Oslo, Norway in 1995 stopped the fighting, dividing Bosnia-Herzegovina into Croat and Serbian entities. But the Oslo Accord had failed to deal with the problem of another part of the old Yugoslavia, the province of Kosovo, which, with a majority of its population Albanian and a minority being Serbian, was demanding independence from Serbia. The Serbian president, Slobodan Milosevic, had shown his ruthlessness earlier in Bosnia, and now, facing armed attack from Kosovo nationalists, attacked Kosovo, killing perhaps 2,000 people and causing several 100,000 to become refugees. An international gathering in Rambouillet, France, was supposed to try to solve the problem diplomatically, but it presented terms to Yugoslavia that seemed certain to be rejected. NATO control of all of Kosovo, and NATO military occupation of the rest of Yugoslavia. On March 23, 1999, the Serbian National Assembly responded with a counter-proposal, rejecting NATO occupation and calling for negotiations leading toward the reaching of a political agreement on a wide-ranging autonomy for Kosovo. The Serbian proposal was ignored and was not reported in the major newspapers of the United States. The following day, NATO forces, meaning mostly US forces, began the bombing of Yugoslavia. Presumably, the bombing was to stop the ethnic cleansing of Kosovo, that is, the forcing of Albanians out of the province by death or intimidation. But after 2 weeks of bombing, the New York Times reported, April 5, 1999, that more than 350,000 have left Kosovo since March 24th. 2 months later, with the bombing still going on, the figure had risen to over 800,000. The bombing of Yugoslavia, including the capital city of Belgrade, apparently intended to unseat Milosevic, led to an untold number of civilian casualties. An email message came to the United States from a professor at the University of Nice. The little town of Aleksinac, 20 miles away from my hometown, was hit last night with full force. The local hospital was hit, and the whole street was simply wiped out. What I know for certain is 6 dead civilians and more than 50 badly hurt. There was no military target around whatsoever. A New York Times reporter, Stephen Erlanger, described the mounded rubble across narrow Zmaj Street, where Alexander Milic, 37, died on Tuesday. Mr. Milic's wife, Vesna, 35, also died. So did his mother and his 2 children, Miljana, 15, and Vladimir, 11. All of them killed about noon, when an errant NATO bomb obliterated their new house and the cellar in which they were sheltering. When a peace agreement was finally signed on June 3, 1999, it was a compromise between the Rambouillet Accord, which Yugoslavia had rejected, and the Serbian National Assembly proposal, which had never been seriously considered. Noam Chomsky, in his book, The New Military Humanism, examined in detail the events of that spring and concluded, the outcome as of June 3rd suggests that diplomatic initiatives could have been pursued on March 23rd, averting a terrible human tragedy. But it seemed that the Clinton administration, like so many before it, Truman in Korea, Johnson in Vietnam, Bush in the Gulf War, chose military solutions when diplomatic ones were possible. The militarization of the nation, the huge military budgets, the maintenance of armed forces all over the world, the repeated use of weapons against other countries, meant that the resources available for human needs were not available. In one of his finer moments, President Dwight Eisenhower had said, Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired, signifies in a final sense a theft from those who are hungry and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. Clinton's economic program, at first announced as a job creation program, was soon to change direction and concentrate on reduction of the deficit, which under Reagan and Bush had left a national debt of $4 trillion. But this emphasis meant that there would be no bold program of expenditures for universal health care, education, childcare, housing, the environment, the arts, or job creation. Clinton's small gestures would not come close to what was needed in a nation where 1/4 of the children lived in poverty, where homeless people lived on the streets in every major city, where women could not look for work for lack of childcare, where the air, the water were deteriorating dangerously. The United States was the richest country in the world, with 5% of the Earth's population, yet consuming 30% of what was produced worldwide. But only a tiny portion of the American population benefited. This richest 1% of the population saw its wealth increase enormously starting in the late 1970s. As a result of changes in the tax structure, by 1995, that richest 1% had gained over $1 trillion and now owned 40% of the nation's wealth. According to the business magazine Forbes, the 400 richest families owned $92 billion in 1982, but 13 years later this had jumped to $480 billion. In the 90s, the wealth of the 500 corporations of the Standard & Poor's Index had increased by 335%. The Dow Jones average of stock prices had gone up 400% between 1980 and 1995, while the average wage of workers had declined in purchasing power by 15%. It was therefore possible to say that the U.S. economy was healthy, but only if you considered the richest part of the population. Meanwhile, 40 million people were without health insurance, the number having risen by 33% in the 90s, and infants died of sickness and malnutrition at a rate higher than that of any other industrialized country. There seemed to be unlimited funds for the military, but people who performed vital human services in health and education had to struggle to barely survive. A 27-year-old woman named Kim Lee Jacobson, interviewed in the Boston Globe, epitomized the distorted national priorities. She had been named U.S. Toddler Teacher of 1999, but as she said, "I'm hitting $20,000 this year after 5 years in the field. It all works out. I didn't come for a lot of money, so I don't expect to have a lot." According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics of the U.S. Census Bureau, in 1998, 1 of every 3 working people in the United States had jobs paying at or below the federal poverty level. The writer Barbara Ehrenreich spent a year working at various jobs, house cleaner, waitress, factory worker, and reported in her book, Nickeled and Dimed, that jobs such as those left workers unable to afford housing or medical care or even adequate food. For people of color, the statistics were especially troubling. Black infants died at twice the rate of white children, and the life expectancy of a black man in Harlem, according to a United Nations report, was 46 years, less than that in Cambodia or the Sudan. This racial discrepancy was explained by some people as racial inferiority, as genetic deficiency. But what was clear was that growing up in a terrible environment, whatever one's natural abilities, became an insurmountable handicap for millions of Americans, whether white or black. A Carnegie Endowment study showed that 2 young people of equal standing on intelligence tests, even accepting the dubious worth of intelligence tests for children brought up under different circumstances, had very different futures depending on whom their parents were. The child of a lawyer, though rating no higher on mental tests than the child of a janitor, was 4 times as likely to go to college, 12 times as likely to finish college, and 27 times as likely to end up in the top 10% of American incomes. To change that situation, to bring about even a rough equality of opportunity, would require a drastic redistribution of wealth, a huge expenditure of money for job creation, health, education, and the environment. The United States, instead, was consigning its people to the mercy of the free market, forgetting or choosing to forget the disastrous consequence of such a policy in the 20s. The market did not care about the environment or the arts, and it left many Americans without the basic means of subsistence, including adequate housing. Under Reagan, the government had reduced the number of housing units getting subsidies from 400,000 to 40,000. In the Clinton administration, the program ended altogether. Despite Clinton's 1997 Inauguration Day promise of a new government, his presidency offered no bold program to take care of these needs. For instance, although public opinion polls through the 80s and 90s indicated that the American people would support a program of free universal medical care supported by the General Treasury, Clinton was reluctant to advocate this. Instead, he put his wife Hillary in charge of a commission, whose final report was over 1,000 pages long, impossibly dense and complicated, and yet offering no answer to the problem: how to assure every American medical care free of the intervention of profiteering insurance companies. Aside from creating an even larger deficit, and there were economists who did not believe that reducing the deficit was necessary when crucial needs were not being met, there were two possible sources to pay for a bold program of social reconstruction, and the Clinton administration was not inclined to tap either one. One source was the military budget. Randall Forsberg, an expert on military expenditures, had suggested during the presidential campaign of 1992 that a military budget of $60 billion to be achieved over a number of years would support a demilitarized U.S. foreign policy appropriate to the needs and opportunities of the post-Cold War world. However, a military budget of $60 billion to be achieved over a number of years would support a demilitarized U.S. foreign policy appropriate to the needs and opportunities of the post-Cold War world. However, the military budget kept increasing, even after the fall of the supposed target of the military buildup, and by the end of Clinton's term was about $300 billion a year. A radical reduction of the military budget would require a renunciation of war, a withdrawal of military bases from around the world, an acceptance, finally, of the principle enunciated in the UN Charter that the world should renounce the scourge of war. It would speak to the fundamental human desire, overwhelmed too often by barrages of super-patriotic slogans, to live at peace with others. The public appeal for such a dramatic policy change would be based on a simple but powerful moral argument that given the nature of modern warfare, the victims would be mostly civilians. To put it another way, war in our time is always a war against children. And if the children of other countries are to be granted an equal right to life with our own children, then we must use our extraordinary human ingenuity to find non-military solutions for world problems. The other possible source to pay for social reform was the wealth of the super-rich. The richest 1% of the country had gained over $1 trillion in the 80s and 90s as a result of tax breaks. A wealth tax, something not yet done as national policy, but perfectly feasible, could retrieve that $1 trillion, for instance, at $100 billion a year for 10 years, and still leave that 1% very, very rich. In addition, a truly progressive income tax, going back to the post-World War II levels of 70 to 90% on very high incomes, could yield another $100 billion a year. Clinton did raise taxes on the super-rich by a few percentage points, changing the top rate from 31% to 37%, and corporate taxes from 34% to 35%. But this was a pitifully small step in view of the need. With the $400 or $500 billion gained each year by progressive taxation and demilitarization, there would be funds available to pay for a universal healthcare system funded by the government as Medicare is administered, as the healthcare system in Canada is handled, without the profit-taking by insurance companies. Those funds could pay for a full employment program, for the first time implementing the 1946 Full Employment Act, which committed the national government to creating useful employment opportunities for all people able and willing to work. One of Marge Piercy's poems ends with, "The pitcher cries for water to carry, and a person for work that is real." Instead of giving out contracts for jet bombers and nuclear submarines, contracts could be offered to nonprofit corporations to hire people to build homes, construct public transport systems, clean up the rivers and lakes, turn our cities into decent places to live. The alternative to such a bold program was to continue as before, allowing the cities to fester, forcing rural people to face debt and foreclosures, offering no useful work for the young, creating a marginal population of idle, desperate people, many of them young, many of them people of color, who turned to drugs and crime, constituting a threat to the physical security of the rest of the population. The response of the government to such signs of desperation, anger, and alienation has been historically quite predictable. Build more jails, lock up more people, execute more prisoners, and continue with the same policies that produced the desperation. And so, by the end of the Clinton administration, the United States had more of its population in prison per capita, a total of 2 million people, than any other country in the world, with the possible exception of China. Clinton claimed to be moderating his policies to match public opinion, but opinion surveys in the 80s and early 90s indicated that Americans favored bold policies that neither Democrats nor Republicans were willing to put forward. Universal free health care, guaranteed employment, government help for the poor and homeless, with taxes on the rich and cuts in the military budget to pay for social programs. The gap between national policy and the feelings of the American public suggested that another scenario was possible, one that envisioned in the new millennium citizens organizing to demand what the Declaration of Independence promised, a government that protected the equal right of everyone to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This meant economic arrangements that distributed the national wealth rationally and humanely. This meant a culture where the young no longer were taught to strive for success as a mask for greed. Throughout the 90s, while conservative Republicans and moderate Democrats were running the government, there were large numbers of American citizens, unrepresented in Washington, unreported in the press, who were protesting government policy in various ways and demanding a more just and peaceful society. The signs of citizen energy outside the circles of power in Washington were not given much attention in the national media, except when a phenomenon was too big to ignore. Even a gathering of 500,000 adults and children of all colors arriving in the nation's capital to stand for children was paid little or no attention by television and newspapers. The signs of defiance and resistance were many and varied. In Minneapolis, there was a continuing campaign against a corporation that manufactured landmines. An ex-GI who had been mutilated by an American landmine came to Minneapolis to join the campaign, joined by a young woman who was traveling all over the world to tell people of the children dying on all continents as a result of millions of landmines planted by the United States and other nations. 4 nuns, the McDonald sisters, who were indeed sisters, participated in the protest and were arrested. In 1994 in Los Angeles, in opposition to a new California law that took away basic health and educational rights from the children of illegal immigrants, 250,000 people took to the streets in protest. When the United States made clear its intention to drop bombs on Iraq, presumably because Iraq was not allowing inspection of what American officials called weapons of mass destruction, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and other officials spoke to a town meeting in Columbus, Ohio, to build up public support for the bombing. But the planned scenario was interrupted by a young man who, despite plans to control all questions, managed to get the floor and ask Madeleine Albright about all the other nations, allies of the United States, that possessed weapons of mass destruction. The Secretary of State was obviously taken by surprise and stumbled through an answer, which a national TV audience could plainly see. Plans for the bombing were quickly postponed, though sometime later, the regular bombing of Iraq, of which the press took no notice, resumed. When Madeleine Albright was given an honorary degree by the University of California at Berkeley in the year 2000, there were protests in the audience and a huge banner, "Madeleine Albright is a war criminal." Protesters and the banner were removed from the theater. It happened that the student selected to receive the university's prestigious University Medal and to give the student address at commencement was a young Palestinian woman named Fadia Rafidi. She was moved to the end of the program so that Albright could speak and leave, but she was determined to speak to Albright's defense of the U.S. sanctions against Iraq. She spoke of the medical supplies not allowed into Iraq, about the hundreds of thousands of deaths of children as a result of the sanctions. She agreed that Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator, but, she said, when he was gassing the Kurds, he was gassing them using chemical weapons that were manufactured in Rochester, New York. And when he was fighting a long and protracted war with Iran, where 1 million people died, it was the CIA that was funding him. It was U.S. policy that built this dictator. When they didn't need him, they started imposing sanctions on his people. Sanctions should be directed at people's governments, not at the people. In 1998, 7,000 people from all over the country traveled to Fort Benning, Georgia, to protest the existence of the School of the Americas, whose graduates, trained by the United States, had participated in atrocities in various Latin American countries. They carried 8 caskets representing the 6 priests, a cook, and a young girl who had been assassinated by military men invading their home. Ironically, the Georgia federal judge who sentenced them to prison terms, Robert J. Elliott, was the same judge who had pardoned Lieutenant William Calley, found guilty of the My Lai massacre of villagers in Vietnam. On the anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki in August 1999, 8 pacifists decided to block 4 lanes of traffic leading to a nuclear submarine base in Bangor, Maine. At that base, 8 Trident submarines were housed, carrying over 1,000 nuclear warheads. The protesters were arrested. They managed to explain to the jury, however, the reason for their opposition to nuclear weapons, and they were acquitted. The woman who headed the jury said later, "I am proud to sit with these people." The culture had been affected by the movements of the 60s in a way that could not be obliterated. There was an unmistakable, stubborn new consciousness, manifested from time to time in the cinema, on television, in the world of music, an awareness that women deserved equal rights, that the sexual preferences of men and women were their own affair, that the growing gap between rich and poor gave the lie to the word democracy. Racism was still deeply embedded in American society. The evidence was in continued police brutality against people of color, in the higher rates of infant mortality in the black population, the lack of jobs for young blacks, and the corresponding growth of crime and imprisonment. But the country was becoming more diverse. More Latino people, more Asians, more interracial marriages. It was projected that by the year 2050, people of color would be equal in number to whites in the United States. There were sporadic attempts to organize the discontent among the nation's African Americans. In the late 80s, there had been a hint of a future possibility, as the black leader Jesse Jackson, speaking for the poor and dispossessed of all colors, a rainbow coalition, won millions of votes in the presidential primary and gave the nation a brief, rare surge of political excitement. In 1995, 1 million men traveled from all over the country to Washington, D.C. The Million Man March, to declare to the nation's leaders that they intended to become a force for change. The march did not have a clear agenda, but it was an expression of solidarity. In the summer of 1998, 2,000 African American men met in Chicago to found the Black Radical Congress. The following year, the West Coast Longshoremen's Union carried out an 8-hour work stoppage in protest against the incarceration and death sentence of Mumia Abu-Jamal. Jamal was a respected black journalist who had been tried and sentenced under circumstances that suggested his race and his radicalism, as well as his persistent criticism of the Philadelphia police, were the reasons he now sat on death row. The labor movement in the 90s was showing signs of a new energy. This despite the gradual decline in union membership as manufacturing plants moved out of the country and industrial workers were being outnumbered by service and white-collar workers who were more difficult to organize. There was impetus for a new militancy as it became clear that the wealth of the nation was going mostly to the very rich, and the gap between rich and poor was growing. In the 90s, the income of the richest 5% of the population grew by 20%, while the income of the poor and middle class, taking into consideration the rise in cost of living, either fell or remained the same. In 1990, the average pay of the chief executive officers of the 500 largest corporations was 84 times that of the average worker. By 1999, it was 475 times the average worker's pay. A new president of the AFL-CIO, John Sweeney, coming out of the Service Employees International Union, a sign of the change in the labor force, appeared to depart sharply from the conservatism of his predecessors. He encouraged the idea of a union summer, inspired by the Freedom Summer in Mississippi in 1964, tapping the idealism of young people by inviting them to help in the organizing of the new service workers, white-collar workers, farm workers, immigrant workers. The unions were losing some strikes, as in the long, bitter struggles in the 90s in Decatur, Illinois, against 3 corporate giants, Caterpillar, Firestone, and Staley. But there were also victories. United Parcel Service workers went on strike for 15 days, a strike that brought great national attention and won their demand that part-time jobs without health and other benefits be converted to 10,000 full-time jobs with benefits. The Machinists Union won strikes at the Boeing Company and McDonnell Douglas. Hotel workers won strikes in Minneapolis and San Francisco. Cleaning women, mostly immigrants, were victorious in Los Angeles, striking against owners of skyscrapers where the poorly paid workers cleaned the offices of the city's most prosperous business people. In the year 2000, the biggest white-collar strike in the nation's history was one for 19,000 engineers and professional workers of Boeing, who succeeded in having their salaries match those of workers in other Boeing plants. One of the greatest union victories in decades took place in Los Angeles County in 1999, where, after an 11-year campaign, the Service Employees International Union won the right to represent 74,000 home healthcare workers. That same year, the newly merged unions of garment workers and textile workers, called UNITE, Union of Needle Trades, Industrial and Textile Employees, workers, which had been trying for 25 years to organize Cannon Mills in North Carolina, won their union election at 2 mills in Kannapolis. Women were taking a leading role in the new leadership of the AFL-CIO. Karen Nussbaum, who had been president of the 9 to 5 National Association of Working Women, became director of the Working Women's Department of the AFL-CIO. And by 1998, 10 of the 21 departments of the union were headed by women. An alliance between students and the labor movement was being forged by the campaign for a living wage for campus workers, which soon spread to 150 college campuses. For instance, at Harvard University, students organized to demand that the Harvard administration, sitting on a treasury of $20 billion, pay their janitors and other service employees a wage sufficient to support their families. Many of these workers had to work 2 jobs, as much as 80 hours a week, to pay for rent and food and medical care. The Harvard students staged colorful rallies in which janitors and other campus workers spoke about their needs. Members of the Cambridge City Council and trade union leaders, including John Sweeney and other high officers of the AFL-CIO, took the microphone to declare their support. The arrival of 2 young movie stars, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, to support the campaign attracted a huge crowd. Both had lived and gone to school in Cambridge. Matt Damon had spent a few years at Harvard before dropping out to go to Hollywood. Ben Affleck spoke movingly about his father, working poorly paid at a menial job at Harvard. When the Harvard administration continued to refuse to negotiate, 40 students took over one of the Harvard administration buildings and remained there day and night for several weeks, supported by hundreds of people outside with tents spread out on the campus grass. Support for the sit-in came from all over the country, and finally, Harvard agreed to negotiate. The upshot was a victory for the campus workers, with Harvard agreeing to raise the pay of janitors to $14 an hour and to give health benefits and to insist that outside contractors match those conditions. In the spring of 2000, students at Wesleyan University in Connecticut occupied the admissions office, insisting that the university president guarantee a living wage, health and retirement benefits, and job security to janitors and other service workers. After several days of the sit-in, the university agreed to comply with the demands. Students around the country organized a workers' rights consortium. At Yale University, the University of Arizona, Syracuse University, the University of Kentucky, and on many other campuses, students carried on campaigns to support the demands of working people. The Living Wage campaign took a powerful hold on popular sympathies at a time when the rich were becoming richer. In Duluth, Minnesota, 56 organizations joined forces to demand that the city give contracts only to businesses that gave a living wage. This meant several dollars above the official minimum wage to employees. The 5-year limit on federal aid to families with dependent children, set in the 1996 welfare reform legislation, meant that millions of people would face deprivation when their benefits expired. Activists began organizing seriously in the year 2000 for that eventuality, bringing people from all over the country into a campaign to end poverty. A veteran of the welfare rights movement in Boston, Diane Dujan, declared, "In the richest country in the year 2000, no one should be living hungry, homeless, and under stress of not knowing how to feed their children and still pay the rent." The Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign in 1998 organized a bus tour of 35 cities to pull together the stories of people who could not feed their families, whose electricity had been cut off, who had been evicted from their homes because they could not afford to pay their bills. The following year, some of the PPEHRC traveled to Geneva, Switzerland, to testify before the UN Commission on Human Rights. They pointed to the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Eleanor Roosevelt had helped to draw up, and which declared that decent wages, food, housing, healthcare, and education was a right of all people. Religious leaders who had been quiet since their involvement in the movements for civil rights and against the Vietnam War began to speak out on economic inequality. In the summer of 1996, the New York Times reported, "More than at any other time in decades, religious leaders are making common cause with trade unions, lending their moral authority to denounce sweatshops, back a higher minimum wage, and help organize janitors and poultry workers. The clergy has not lined up with labor to such an extent since the heyday of Cesar Chavez, the charismatic farm workers leader in the 70s, and perhaps the Depression." All of these groups and the people they represented, the homeless, the struggling mothers, the families unable to pay their bills, the 40 million without health insurance, and the many more with inadequate insurance, were facing an enormous barrier of silence in the national culture. Their lives, their plight, was not being reported in the major media. And so the myth of a prosperous America, proclaimed by powerful people in Washington and Wall Street, persisted. There were valiant attempts to break through the control of information, especially after the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which enabled the handful of corporations dominating the airwaves to expand their power further. Mergers enabled tighter control of information. Two gigantic media corporations, CBS and Viacom, joined in a $37 billion deal. The Latin American writer Eduardo Galeano commented, "Never have so many been held incommunicado by so few." Alternative media made desperate attempts to break through this control. There were several hundred community radio stations around the country. The Pacifica Network was the most successful of these, bringing alternative information and ideas to their listeners. A one-man operation by David Barsamian, Alternative Radio, distributed dissident views, interviews, and lectures via satellite to radio stations around the country. Community newspapers in towns and cities around the country, though their circulation was small, tried to tell the stories of ordinary people. In Boston, homeless people joined to publish the newspaper Spare Change, to tell their stories, print their poems, and then to sell the newspaper on the streets of Boston and Cambridge as a way of making some money. They declared their aims to be a voice for the voiceless and to be an organizing tool for the homeless community. By the turn of the century, they had been turning out the newspaper for 8 years. This idea spread to other parts of the country, and soon there were street newspapers in 40 different cities, which formed the North American Street Newspaper Association. The National Coalition for the Homeless, set up in the nation's capital, distributed a monthly newsletter. Perhaps the most dramatic attempt to bring to the American people and to the world the facts of corporate domination over the lives of ordinary people was the great gathering of demonstrators in Seattle, Washington, in the last months of 1999. Seattle had been chosen as the meeting place of the World Trade Organization, and representatives of the most wealthy and powerful institutions on the globe were there to make plans to maintain their wealth and power, to bring the principles of capitalism to work across national boundaries all over the earth. Tens of thousands of people converged on Seattle to protest the plans of the World Trade Organization to expand free trade agreements. This, the protesters argued, meant the freedom of corporations to roam the globe in search of cheap labor, and no restrictions on industrial policies that poisoned the environment. The issues around free trade were complex, but a simple idea seemed to unite those who showed up in Seattle to oppose the WTO: that the health and freedom of ordinary people all over the world should not be sacrificed on behalf of corporate profit. More than 1,000 organizations from 90 countries, representing labor unions, environmental groups, consumers, religious groups, farmers, indigenous people, women's groups, and more, had signed a statement asking governments to stop the expansion of the World Trade Organization. In Seattle, there was a remarkable set of alliances. Steelworkers rallied with environmentalists, and machinists joined animal rights activists. Farmers joined a huge labor march of 40,000 on November 30th. And then union people attended a family farm rally a few days later. The press gave disproportionate attention to a small number of demonstrators who broke windows and created a ruckus. But the overwhelming majority in Seattle were nonviolent, and it was these that the police chose to attack with tear gas and then arrest. Hundreds were jailed, but the demonstrations continued. News of the events in Seattle went to the nation and all over the world. The official WTO meeting was clearly disturbed by the crowds of protesters, and there were signs of division between the industrial countries and third world countries. As John Nichols reported in The Progressive, while the official WTO sessions were characterized by deep divides between delegations from the northern and southern hemispheres, there was an unprecedented level of north-south unity on the streets. Farmers from around the world came together. The huge AFL-CIO rally cheered speakers from close to a dozen countries. And after events organized to highlight the devastating impact that globalization was having on women in the third world, throngs of women from Africa, Latin America, India, Europe, and the United States marched together in human chains through the streets of downtown Seattle. The summit meeting of the World Trade Organization was shaken by all this, and at a certain point, the talks collapsed. It was a remarkable illustration of the ability of organized citizens to challenge the most powerful corporations in the world. Mike Branham, writing in the newspaper of the insurgent Teamsters, caught the mood of exultation. The kind of solidarity that all of us dream of was in the air as people sang, chanted, played music, and stood up to the cops and the WTO. The people owned the streets that day, and it was as much a lesson for us as it was for corporate America. The Seattle demonstrations coincided with a growing movement throughout the nation, on college campuses and in communities against sweatshop conditions endured by third world men, women, even children working for American corporations. The New York Times reported, a month after Seattle, pressure from college students and other opponents of sweatshops has led some factories to make goods for industry giants like Nike and the Gap to cut back on child labor, to use less dangerous chemicals, and to require fewer employees to work 80-hour weeks, according to groups that monitor such factories. As last month's protests in Seattle, conditions in such factories were a major focus, with many demonstrators demanding that trade treaties punish countries that permit violations of minimum labor standards. Many corporate executives acknowledge that the anti-sweatshop movement's efforts are paying off. Seattle was the first of a series of international gatherings of trade union people, students, environmentalists, in opposition to the increasing control of the world economy by giant corporations. In the year following the Seattle demonstrations, protesters showed up wherever a summit of wealthy entrepreneurs was taking place: Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Davos, Switzerland, Los Angeles, and Prague. Officials of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund could not ignore such a protest movement. They began to declare their concern for the environment and the conditions of their workers. Whether this would result in real changes was unclear, but undoubtedly, the corporate leaders of the world could no longer ignore their critics. Would the various strands of protest and resistance in politics, in the workplace, in the culture, come together in the next century, the next millennium, to fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence, of equal rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? No one could predict. All one could do was to act on the possibility, knowing that inaction would make any prediction a gloomy one. If democracy were to be given any meaning, if it were to go beyond the limits of capitalism and nationalism, this would not come, if history were any guide, from the top. It would come through citizens' movements, educating, organizing, agitating, striking, boycotting, demonstrating, threatening those in power with disruption of the stability they needed. Chapter 24, the 2000 election and the war on terrorism. It was clear as Clinton ended his two-term presidency, the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution set 2 terms as a limit, that the Democratic candidate for president would now be the man who served him faithfully as vice president, Albert Gore. The Republican Party chose as its candidate for president the governor of Texas, George W. Bush, Jr., known for his connection to oil interests and the record number of executions of prisoners during his term in office. Although Bush, during the campaign, accused Gore of appealing to class warfare, the candidacy of Gore and his vice president, Senator Joseph Lieberman, posed no threat to the super-rich. A front-page story in the New York Times was headlined, "As a senator, Lieberman is proudly pro-business," and went on to give the details. He was loved by the Silicon Valley high-tech industry, and the military-industrial complex of Connecticut was grateful to him for their $7.5 billion in contracts for the Seawolf submarine. The degree of difference in the corporate support of the two presidential candidates can be measured by the $220 million raised by the Bush campaign and the $170 million raised by the Gore campaign. Neither Gore nor Bush had a plan for free national health care, for extensive low-cost housing, for dramatic changes in environmental controls. Both supported the death penalty and the growth of prisons. Both favored a large military establishment, the continued use of landmines, and the use of sanctions against the people of Cuba and Iraq. There was a third-party candidate, Ralph Nader, whose national reputation came from decades of persistent criticism of corporate control of the economy. His program was sharply different from the two major candidates, emphasizing healthcare, education, and the environment. But he was shut out of the nationally televised debates during the campaign, and without the support of big business, he had to raise money from the small contributions of people who believed in his program. It was predictable, given the unity of both major parties around class issues and the barriers put up against any third-party candidate, that half the country, mostly at lower income levels and unenthusiastic about either major party, would not even vote. A journalist spoke to a cashier at a filling station, wife of a construction worker, who told him, "I don't think they think about people like us. Maybe if they lived in a two-bedroom trailer, it would be different." An African-American woman, a manager at McDonald's who made slightly more than the minimum wage of $5.15 an hour, said about Bush and Gore, "I don't even pay attention to those two, and all my friends say the same. My life won't change." It turned out to be the most bizarre election in the nation's history. Al Gore received hundreds of thousands of votes more than Bush, but the Constitution required that the victor be determined by the electors of each state. The electoral vote was so close that the outcome was going to be determined by the electors of the state of Florida. This difference between popular vote and electoral vote had happened twice before, in 1876 and 1888. The candidate with the most votes in Florida would get all that state's electors and win the presidency. But there was a raging dispute over whether Bush or Gore had received more votes in Florida. It seemed that many votes had not been counted, especially in districts where many black people lived, that ballots had been disqualified on technical grounds, that the marks made on the ballots by the voting machines were not clear. Bush had this advantage. His brother, Jeb Bush, was governor of Florida, and the Secretary of State in Florida, Katherine Harris, a Republican, had the power to certify who had more votes and had won the election. Facing claims of tainted ballots, Harris rushed through a partial recounting that left Bush ahead. An appeal to the Florida Supreme Court, dominated by Democrats, resulted in the court ordering Harris not to certify a winner and for recounting to continue. Harris set a deadline for recounting, and while there were still thousands of disputed ballots, she went ahead and certified that Bush was the winner by 537 votes. This was certainly the closest call in the history of presidential elections. With Gore ready to challenge the certification and ask that recounting continue, as the Florida Supreme Court had ruled, the Republican Party took the case to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court split along ideological lines. The five conservative judges, Rehnquist, Scalia, Thomas, Kennedy, O'Connor, despite the usual conservative position of non-interference with state powers, overruled the Florida Supreme Court and prohibited any more counting of ballots. They said the recounting violated the constitutional requirement for equal protection of the laws because there were different standards in different counties of Florida for counting ballots. The four liberal judges, Stevens, Ginsburg, Breyer, Souter, argued that the court did not have the right to interfere with the Florida Supreme Court's interpretation of state law. Breyer and Souter argued, even if there was a failure to have a uniform standard in counting, the remedy was to let there be a new election in Florida with a uniform standard. The fact that the Supreme Court refused to allow any reconsideration of the election meant that it was determined to see that its favorite candidate, Bush, would be president. Justice Stevens pointed this out with some bitterness in his minority report. Although we may never know with complete certainty the identity of the winner of this year's presidential election, the identity of the loser is perfectly clear. It is the nation's confidence in the judge as an impartial guardian of the rule of law. Bush, taking office, proceeded to pursue his pro-big business agenda with total confidence, as if he had the overwhelming approval of the nation. And the Democratic Party, its fundamental philosophy not too different, became a timid opposition, going along completely with Bush on his foreign policy and differing with him only mildly on his domestic policy. Bush's program became immediately clear. He pushed tax cuts for the wealthy, opposed strict environmental regulations that would cost money for the business interests, and planned to privatize Social Security by having the retirement funds of citizens depend on the stock market. He moved to increase the military budget and to pursue the Star Wars program, though the consensus of scientific opinion was that anti-ballistic missiles in space could not work, and that even if the plan worked, it would only trigger a more furious arms race throughout the world. 9 months into his presidency, on September 11, 2001, a cataclysmic event pushed all other issues into the background. Hijackers on 3 different planes flew the huge jets loaded with fuel into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in downtown New York and into one side of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. As Americans all over the country watched, horrified, they saw on their television screens the towers collapse in an inferno of concrete and metal, burying thousands of workers and hundreds of firemen and policemen who had gone to their rescue. It was an unprecedented assault against enormous symbols of American wealth and power, undertaken by 19 men from the Middle East, most of them from Saudi Arabia. They were willing to die in order to deliver a deadly blow against what they clearly saw as their enemy, a superpower that had thought itself invulnerable. President Bush immediately declared a war on terrorism and proclaimed, "We shall make no distinction between terrorists and countries that harbor terrorists." Congress rushed to pass resolutions giving Bush the power to proceed with military action without the declaration of war that the Constitution required. The resolution passed unanimously in the Senate, and in the House of Representatives, only one member dissented, Barbara Lee, an African American from California. On the supposition that the Islamic militant Osama bin Laden was responsible for the September 11th attacks, and that he was somewhere in Afghanistan, Bush ordered the bombing of Afghanistan. Bush had declared as his objective the apprehension, dead or alive, of Osama bin Laden, and the destruction of the Islamic militant organization Al-Qaeda. But after 5 months of bombing Afghanistan, when Bush delivered his State of the Union address to both houses of Congress, he had to admit, while saying, "We are winning the war on terror," that tens of thousands of trained terrorists are still at large and that dozens of countries were harboring terrorists. It should have been obvious to Bush and his advisors that terrorism could not be defeated by force. The historical evidence was easily available. The British had reacted to terrorist acts by the Irish Republican Army with military action again and again, only to face even more terrorism. The Israelis for decades had responded to Palestinian terrorism with military strikes, which only resulted in more Palestinian bombings. Bill Clinton, after the attack on U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya in 1998, had bombed Afghanistan and the Sudan. Clearly, looking at September 11th, this had not stopped terrorism. Furthermore, the months of bombings had been devastating to a country that had gone through decades of civil war and destruction. The Pentagon claimed that it was only bombing military targets, that the killing of civilians was unfortunate, an accident, regrettable. However, according to human rights groups and accumulated stories in the American and West European press, at least 1,000 and perhaps 4,000 Afghan civilians were killed by American bombs. It seemed that the United States was reacting to the horrors perpetrated by terrorists against innocent people in New York by killing other innocent people in Afghanistan. Every day, the New York Times ran heart-rending vignettes of the victims of the World Trade Center tragedy, with accompanying portraits and descriptions of their work, their interests, their families. There was no way of getting similar information on the Afghan victims, but there were moving accounts by reporters writing from hospitals and villages about the effects of American bombing. A journalist with the Boston Globe, writing from a hospital in Jalalabad, wrote, "In one bed lay Nur Muhammad, 10, who was a bundle of bandages. He lost his eyes and hands to the bomb that hit his house after Sunday dinner." Hospital director Biloja Shimwari shook his head at the boy's wounds. "The United States must be thinking he is Osama," Shimwari said. "If he is not Osama, then why would they do this?" The report continued. The hospital's morgue received 17 bodies last weekend, and officials here estimate at least 89 civilians were killed in several villages. In the hospital yesterday, a bomb's damage could be chronicled in the life of one family. A bomb had killed the father, Faisal Karim. In one bed, his mother, Mustafa Jamal, who had severe head injuries. Around her, 6 of her children were in bandages. One of them, Zahidullah, 8, lay in a coma. The American public, ever since the calamity of September 11th, was overwhelmingly supportive of Bush's policy of a war on terrorism. The Democratic Party went along, vying with the Republicans on who could speak tougher language against terrorism. The New York Times, which had opposed Bush in the election, editorialized in December 2001, "Mr. Bush has proved himself a strong wartime leader who gives the nation a sense of security during a period of crisis." But the full extent of the human catastrophe caused by the bombing of Afghanistan was not being conveyed to Americans by the mainstream press and the major television networks, which seemed determined to show their patriotism. The head of the television network, CNN, Walter Isaacson, sent a memo to his staff saying that images of civilian casualties should be accompanied with an explanation that this was retaliation for the harboring of terrorists. "It seems perverse to focus too much on the casualties or hardships in Afghanistan," he said. The television anchorman Dan Rather declared, "George Bush is the president. Wherever he wants me to line up, just tell me where." The United States government went to great lengths to control the flow of information from Afghanistan. It bombed the building housing the largest television station in the Middle East, Al Jazeera, and bought up a satellite organization that was taking photos showing the results, on the ground, of the bombing. Mass circulation magazines fostered an atmosphere of revenge. In Time magazine, one of its writers, under the headline, "The Case for Rage and Retribution," called for a policy of focused brutality. A popular television commentator, Bill O'Reilly, called on the United States to bomb the Afghan infrastructure to rubble, the airport, the power plants, their water facilities, and the roads. The display of the American flag in the windows of homes, on automobiles, on shop windows, became widespread, and in the atmosphere of wartime jingoism, it became difficult for citizens to criticize government policy. A retired telephone worker in California, who, working out in his health club, made a remark critical of President Bush, was visited by the FBI and questioned. A young woman found at her door 2 FBI men who said they had reports of posters on her wall criticizing the president. Congress passed the USA Patriot Act, which gave the Department of Justice the power to detain non-citizens simply on suspicion, without charges, without the procedural rights provided in the Constitution. It said the Secretary of State could designate any group as terrorist, and any person who was a member of or raised funds for such an organization could be arrested and held until deported. President Bush cautioned the nation not to react with hostility to Arab Americans. But in fact, the government began to round up people for questioning, almost all Muslims, holding 1,000 or more in detention without charges. New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis told of one man arrested on secret evidence, and when a federal judge found there was no reason to conclude that the man was a threat to national